Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is March the 16th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Yo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
How are you doing?
Pretty solid. Recovering from a crazy Dota stream yesterday. But grateful to be alive and to have the opportunity to have different teammates than the previous game. God bless. But I played a bit today, and the teams were a lot better. And I played from the mid lane as well, which gives you a lot more control over the game flow because you have one lane all to yourself against one other person. So the relative control of what's going on is greater. Also, the responsibility is greater. And you're more immediately, I think, forced to make hostile moves on people. Whereas a safe laner, which is what I normally play, you're in the most defensive position of anyone on your team because your character is normally the weakest at the start. And people know that you need money, so they're extra trying to kill you. So going from that position to the mid lane feels pretty different, but it's nice. We also did some Zerg coaching earlier, which was cool. They wanted live coaching, so I was talking to them while they were playing. We went over one replay in addition to that. But live coaching is something that some people prefer over their past games being analyzed. It's just more engaging for them, and they feel like they can build the habits immediately on their existing flow. So that was pretty cool. I haven't really kept it super close tabs with news lately, so we need your help today to see what's going on. I'm not sure if it's been a spicy week or if we just have spicy weeks now and that's just how it is. So I'm trying to acclimate to the new normals of life in this amazing year.
Yeah, I gotcha. No, it was not as high tempo this past week.
Okay.
Definitely developments, but people are kind of edging away from the edge of the cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike the previous week, when it looked like everybody was about to just flip the fuck out. So, better this past week. Still drama, but better.
Good. All hail the regression to the mean. Oh, mighty cosmic force.
Anything else going on?
My heart's still beating from our Onsor fight. I made peace with the honor mode run ending at like multiple points during that fight. I think the first time he zapped us, I was like, oh boy, this is not a good start. And I was like, I don't know. We don't really have any lightning dragon killer experts in the party. And one thing that I've learned from our fight, which I didn't think of going into it, was having a sorcerer is not that useful when it comes down to we wanted to bait his shots away from us with something. So Jaheira would have been way better of an ally to bring because in honor mode, he breaks Globe of Vulnerability concentration with his stomp. They made a specific mechanic to punish that spell. And our whole plan relied on that spell blocking the damage. So our entire plan for the battle failed the first attempt that we used our method, and that meant that we couldn't use it for the rest of the fight, really. I think there were a couple points where we could have used it, like when he flew up into the air, that would be the time to use it, because he's going to do a lightning zap, but when he was on the ground, he just stomps the ground and breaks it.
Yeah.
So that was very exciting. We nearly died. I think it was 34 health on our sorcerer was all we had on the map.
Yeah, it was a near run thing.
Yep.
But we pulled it off.
Yep.
Just barely.
Yep. That is one of the hardest fights. So yeah, I don't know if there's something to be said about just trusting your party composition and just using the balanced tool set that you have. Because if you do bring in a different kind of specialist, you're losing a lot of what you're used to having.
Yeah, synergy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my solo run fought Cazador. I don't know if I told you about that. I think that's...
Yeah, you told me about how badly it went.
Yeah. I did more of the side quests on my own this week.
Oh, cool.
Like zombie quest.
Hmm.
I don't know what happened. I think the Zentarum outpost blew up in that solo run. The artist died somehow. He maybe didn't get his freedom. I'm not sure. But there was no relationship in that tower. Like, they were not together, and there was nothing to decurse from him because he wasn't there in the story. She just hosted a party, and I was able to walk around in the party and stuff. And I'm like, okay, there's no dude, there's no curse, no. So that was surprising. There was no quest to be had. You can trade with the lady, and she can sell you some paintings because she's an art collector, but that's about it. But I'm level 12 in that run, and I can kind of choose my order of bosses now.
That sounds like things are moving along.
Yep. Good Zerg day, too, during the week. Got to get a bunch of highlights and clips. It's insane how much people watch short-form content now. YouTube Shorts make a lot more money than long-form videos because people spam watch them. So they'll watch it like multiple times, whereas a long-form video, people are not as likely these days to have lasting interest in that. They want to see the next thing every like 2 to 5 minutes, basically. And then short-form feeds it to you even faster, which is like every 15 to 30 seconds you're getting something new. It's crazy. Yeah. Like, it's not to be underestimated what it's doing to our brains. So we'll have to stay safe and find a balance.
Yeah, or we could just let attention spans obsolesce.
Yeah.
Who needs it?
Accept the new normal. Welcome to the future.
Well, what are you interested in today? Got tariffs, got Ukraine, got general world stuff. Somebody on YouTube was complaining that we were doing too much Trump and US stuff.
How's South Africa doing? Because there were allegations of a conflict of interest. What's South Africa doing?
South Africa tried to pass, I don't know if we talked about this, they passed a law recently allowing the government to seize land that isn't being used according to some particular, legal definition. I don't remember the details exactly. But Elon Musk apparently got upset about that, and near as I can tell, that's the only way I can explain why the US government suddenly got interested in South Africa, and so the US came out and offered refugee status to Afrikaners. That was some weeks ago, though. That's not this past week. More broadly speaking, it's doing pretty badly. I think the macroeconomic data is actually doing better in the past year. There actually has been some improvement, but the fundamentals are not strong. The government hasn't really dealt with the underlying issue of corruption. The economy is still disproportionately dependent on the primary sector, extractive industries, mining, diamonds, agriculture, stuff like that. Beyond that, pretty much status quo. I don't think there's been a whole lot of change over the past year that I can think of off the top of my head. I think one thing that happened this past weekend was, what was it? The United States government declared the ambassador from South Africa to be persona non grata, which basically means he has to leave. And that had to do with some statements that he made that the government here didn't like. Basically, statements to the effect that the American government, specifically the Trump administration, was a government that was upholding white supremacy. Yeah, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but basically that was the gist of it. So as you might guess, the Trump administration responded to that with the dignity and grace for which it is known, and declared him persona non grata.
Interesting. You are officially hereby to be exiled.
Yeah, I still don't take it very seriously. The United States just has not, in terms of foreign policy anyway, has not given a shit about South Africa since apartheid ended. So I just see it as more theater.
Mm-hmm.
There's not really an underlying fundamental interest that the United States has in South Africa that would justify or incentivize significant attention. And that hasn't changed. So yeah, I think it's just the admin trying to score some more points. Mm-hmm. That seems to be just about their favorite thing to do.
Scoring imaginary points or real reputation points.
Well, we could just try to do general world stuff, and then we can move into Ukraine and tariffs. I don't think we'll have time to do just all of the Trump stuff. We have a big backlog, and it just keeps getting bigger.
Gotcha. Yeah, sure.
All right. So I'll preface this by just saying up front, you're not going to like this. It's not good news this week. There's quite a bit of things happening around the world that will not be to anybody's taste. So kind of prepare yourself mentally for that. So that said, I have a map for you. I'll send that to you. And you can look at it at your leisure, whenever you have time. But it's a map of Sudan, and it has the current front lines in the civil war in it. And so it's a useful visual aid, because I don't think most people are familiar, at all with Sudan's geography. And so it can be a little confusing when you talk about the civil war and, who's moving where, taking what, etc. There we go. Yeah, so the update for the Sudan civil war is that the government had some success in the ongoing Battle of Khartoum, which I remind you has been going on for, 2 years now, thereabouts? It's a city of 10 million some people, and the civil war pretty much started right in the middle of it. So the city has been suffering grievously on that count, as well as the population therein. So the sooner that battle ends, the better, but there's no sign that it will anytime soon, unfortunately. However, the government was able to recently take back a pretty significant chunk of territory in the capital, including their headquarters. Keep in mind that the government is basically just the army of Sudan at this point. And they had, just to restate it, they had lost their entire headquarters, all of their infrastructure that they had, through which they had run the military, and by extension, basically the country. They lost that pretty early on in the conflict. So getting it back was a pretty significant symbolic victory for them. It's not going to change much. They've long since relocated their government to Port Sudan on the coast. But still, it was notable that they were able to take it back. That was a nice thing for them. Beyond the capital, they were also able to take near full control of the state of Gezira, which was also a big deal. Other than that, the RSF, which is the other faction in the civil war, has been talking about setting up a separate state. Before, they had been kind of angling to take control of the whole country, but in the past few months, they've been kind of shifting away from that position and have been signaling that they might prefer to have just their own independent country. Presumably, it would be centered on Darfur, which is where their power base is. But they may or may not get more territory beyond that, depending on where the front lines are. The UAE, that is to say the United Arab Emirates, is probably the major foreign backer of the RSF, and they've signaled that they would support that, although it's debatable just how much political and diplomatic capital they would be willing to actually commit to that. The UAE does back the RSF, but they're not really that invested in the conflict. The reason that they back the RSF has more to do with the kind of quid pro quo, a kind of payback. The RSF's forces before the civil war were actually used by the UAE as shock troopers in some of the other conflicts in the Middle East that the UAE has its thumb in. And so, in addition to kind of paying them money for doing that, there's also a sense that they kind of owe them. And so they've been propping them up just in case, as payback, and also just in case they might need them again later. So the UAE maintains that relationship, and they've signaled that, they might back an independent state, but I don't know that their ties are really strong enough for the UAE to really commit to it and make it happen. So that's kind of a big question right now. Other than that, the latest development that I had is that Sudan suspended all imports from Kenya. And this had to do with a summit that was held in Nairobi that hosted the RSF. And I think they were talking about setting up an actual formal parallel government. Again, in that vein that I just spoke of, trying to set up an independent state. So the army in Sudan wasn't happy about that. They want all the other governments in the region to not recognize the RSF, not deal with them, certainly not give them guns and money like the Emiratis do. And so they were particularly upset that Kenya hosted that summit. And so the response has been to just cut off all trade with Kenya.
I have the map up that you sent me.
Yeah.
What is the white area? There's the red, blue, and yellow.
There's nothing there, man.
It's just desert?
It's just empty desert.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there's like maybe some Berbers or something, but there's no like population centers. There's not even really like greenery of any kind. Maybe some oases, but beyond that, it's just wasteland for the most part. So not only is there not really many, if any, people in that region, there's not really much, if any, infrastructure. Not a lot of roads and whatnot.
Gotcha.
And so much as there are very few in number. So you said the red there is the army and the blue is RSF. And the province of Darfur is the westernmost province, as I understand it. So that's where the RSF has its power base.
Gotcha. What is Eritrea doing with them?
Eritrea? Not much. Eritrea is more interested in Ethiopia. They're coming up soon, don't worry.
Oh, okay.
I've got them in the notes too.
Nice.
Yeah, Sudan's civil war is kind of having a spillover effect and overlaps with some of the other drama that's been going on. So we'll talk about that shortly. So in that vein, South Sudan, what's going on there? Occasionally people ask about it for some reason. Of all the random countries in Africa to ask about, if I had to guess which one, a Twitch chat would randomly ask about, South Sudan would be pretty much the bottom of the list. I'm always surprised people even remember it. But it has been in the news recently. For those of you who don't know anything about South Sudan, it's either the newest country on Earth or one of the newest countries on Earth. They only just got their independence like 10 plus years ago, or I guess 15 some years ago now. And their independence was from Sudan, which they had formerly been a part of. And the Sudanese had been very resistant to letting them go because a lot of the country's oil was actually located there. So unsurprisingly, the idea of separating it into an independent country didn't really appeal to Sudan very much. Their trouble is that the people of South Sudan ethnically are much different than the population of Sudan. Sudan is a majority ethnic Arab country. South Sudan is sort of an assortment of sub-Saharan African ethnicities that are distinctly non-Arab. Diverse in and of themselves, but definitely not Arab. And also generally more either pagan or Christian in religious orientation, as opposed to the Muslim Arabs in the north. So that civil war kind of raged off and on for around half a century or so, and then it kind of reached its crescendo in the the aughts, technically. And then the Obama administration oversaw the peace agreement that resulted in South Sudanese independence. But after independence, there was a lot of tension between the different factions of the rebel groups that had fought against the Sudanese government. They did not get along. Part of that was ethnic tension. Basically, the factions that controlled the government after independence were basically just ethnic factions. They represented the different major ethnic groups. And considerable violence resulted from that. And it wasn't even like conventional warfare where you had like a front line and stuff. It was basically just terrorism, indiscriminate killings, occasional ethnic cleansing, that kind of violence, sort of low-intensity warfare type violence. And it was very difficult over time to try to get that under control. Now, eventually what happened is that there was a ceasefire in 2018, a peace deal, if you'd like. And that peace deal was between the groups representing the majority ethnic group, which was, I believe, the Dinka, and the second largest group, the Neuro. And the leader of the Dinka was a guy named Kiir. He's the president. And then the leader of the Neuro is Machar, a guy named Machar. He's the vice president. That was sort of the power sharing deal that they agreed to. And there's still been violence since 2018, but it's been, one, intermittent, and two, less intense than it was before in the period after independence. So things were okay. But in the past few months, tensions have escalated pretty significantly. For one, Machar, again, the vice president, has said that the president's forces, specifically the army, has been raiding his forces, because he actually does have his own, basically, paramilitary force loyal to him. He says the army has been raiding his forces in a nearby county, basically close to the capital. That accusation was made at the end of February. He also says attacks have been happening in other parts of the country as well. And then in early March, there was a militia with ties to the vice president that actually attacked and successfully captured an army base close to the border with Ethiopia, which obviously is a pretty significant escalation. So you can see how the direction of travel is pretty negative here. So in response to that, the president had several of Machar's allies in the government arrested. And that kicked off some significant violence in the capital. It's also worth pointing out that part of the violence in the capital encompassed not only ethnic violence between the Dinka and the Neuro, but also targeting Arabs. Obviously, the Arabs were kind of the enemy during the War of Independence, and also people don't really appreciate foreign merchants in pretty much any society. I could go on a whole tangent about that, but that's a very consistent theme. So foreign shop owners, foreign merchants, foreign traders of one kind or another were systematically targeted and rioting in the capital of South Sudan, kind of corresponded with this over the past couple months. So a rising tide of violence, if you like. The most recent development is that the state of Uganda, I should say the government of Uganda, announced that they would send troops to the capital of South Sudan in order to act as peacekeepers. Interestingly, the South Sudanese government denied that, but the Ugandan government has been very insistent that that is, in fact, something that was agreed to and is going to happen. So make of that what you will. Regardless, it seems the Ugandan troops are on their way. To give some context here, Uganda backs the president, effectively the Dinka. And okay, so that's the foreign policy background. So the domestic background here, one of the reasons for the escalating tension in the past couple months has to do with the Sudan civil war, like I was mentioning earlier. Like I said, most of Sudan's oil had been in South Sudan, but the infrastructure by which that oil was piped out of the country ran through Sudan proper. And so even after Sudan became independent and was hoping to enjoy a bunch of money from, all of the oil reserves there, they still had to strike a deal with the Sudanese government to share revenue because all of that oil had to go through pipelines running through Sudan. So, Sudan wasn't completely screwed over by the loss of South Sudan, and South Sudan did not benefit as much as it probably would have hoped. They could have tried to build another pipeline, but, it's Africa, so that's actually very difficult. Not a lot of investors interested in risking money in the region, especially one as restive and violent as South Sudan. So that didn't happen, so they were pretty much stuck with the infrastructure they had before they were independent. So anyway, during the Civil War, that pipeline was damaged. And the Sudanese army, again, basically the government, was not willing to allow it to be repaired. Well, all right, they were not able to repair it because the RSF itself was not willing to allow it to be repaired. They wanted to sabotage it because most of that money goes to the Sudanese army, which again is their main enemy. So the RSF sabotaged it. the army couldn't fix it, and so the result then is that South Sudan's government lost out on a whole bunch of revenue. And because of the way power is allocated in the South Sudanese government, that meant that the respective major political actors, again, mostly Kiir and Machar here, they could not pay for their patronage networks. And I think we've talked about that before, how like very corrupt countries and developing countries, it's generally the case that the political system is not led by ideologues. Generally, it's led by patronage networks, led by charismatic, powerful figures of one kind or another. So the main patronage networks in South Sudan basically came under a lot of pressure because those need money, and without oil revenue, they couldn't afford them. And so the result is that a lot of people became very restive, started challenging the leaders in power, and they radicalized correspondingly. You know, they wanted more. And also, it's worth pointing out that maintenance of the patronage networks was kind of de facto part of the 2018 peace deal. You know, it was internationally, they were pressured by international actors to sign the deal, but part of the quid pro quo for agreeing to it is that they would get more money, basically. So instead of having one group trying to dominate the other and monopolize the oil revenue the country was getting, they would split it, according to a deal signed as part of the overarching 2018 peace deal. So with that money gone, then the impetus for peace was gone, and that also contributed to the unraveling peace that we're seeing right now. Now, this also ties into the Sudan civil war, because the president of South Sudan, seeing that the government of Sudan can't ensure access to, well, can't ensure that the pipelines can stay active, has been shifting closer to the RSF in the civil war, in the hope that maybe they'll be able to help fix the pipelines, or at least stop sabotaging them. And the result of that is that the Sudanese army is actually considering more intervention in South Sudan. So basically, the South Sudanese government is getting closer to the major rebel faction in the Sudanese civil war. Correspondingly, the Sudanese government is now starting to back the largest, well, the second largest ethnic group and the main rival to the government, to the political leaders controlling the government in South Sudan anyway, that being Machar and the Neuro. And so the risk is clear. Basically, the risk is that there could be resumed fighting between the dominant political groups in South Sudan, and that they may in turn become a proxy front, a proxy war of the Sudanese factions fighting in their own civil war. And that could lead to considerable violence. It's worth mentioning, too, that the Emiratis, you know, like I said earlier, they have ties with the RSF. So it's possible the Emiratis may step into South Sudan and back the preferred faction of their proxy, the RSF. So it's not just, it might not just be an extension of the Sudanese civil war. It could turn into a conflagration that brings in regional actors like the Emiratis, potentially the Saudis, potentially the Egyptians and Ethiopians as well, as they prop up one or the other faction as a proxy in the conflict. So all of that would result in significant escalation and would make the conflict like much more deadly than it would be otherwise, which is why there's been more discussion of it recently in foreign policy circles. This still isn't a conflict that's very high on the international radar, so to speak. You know, obviously, Trump's shenanigans kind of eats up all the oxygen in that regard. But this is something that could crop up and become a big issue. Sudan's civil war basically may not stay restrained to its borders. And so that brings us then to Ethiopia, which, unlike South Sudan, isn't really kind of tied in implicitly with the Sudanese civil war. However, it is tied in sort of with broader East African regional competition. So, for example, Egypt is relevant here because Egypt is angry at Ethiopia because of this huge-ass dam they built on one of the tributaries to the Nile that runs through Ethiopian territory. It's called the Grand Renaissance Dam. And the Egyptians say that the Ethiopian government needs to come to an agreement with them. You know, they actually said before it even finished construction there needed to be a deal. And the Ethiopians weren't really willing to play ball, and so that's poisoned relations between them. And Egypt has been seeking out ways here and there over the past decade to try to pressure the Ethiopian government into doing this, that, or the other, mostly regarding the Grand Renaissance Dam, but also possibly, other issues like, for example, Somalia and maybe Sudan. So we'll get to that, but for now, the issue with Ethiopia is that it's quite possible there may be another war there. And you may remember way back in 2020, we talked about, what were they? Not cicadas, locusts. We talked about the locusts, remember? There was the big outbreak in East Africa and the Middle East. And at the same time that was happening, there was a big war that broke out in Ethiopia, specifically between the government and Tigray province. It's more complicated than just that, but it basically kind of happened at the same time as the locust thing. And so in my head, it's always been sort of the locust war. So that war did finish. The Ethiopian government, long story short, was able to reassert control over the province. But it was a very deadly conflict, even though it ran under the international, radar. I think something like 500,000 people died, either because of the fighting itself or because of starvation, since one of the things that happened is that the province of Tigray was cut off from international aid. It was all pretty ugly, and everybody was very grateful when it finally finished. But now it's looking like there could be an even bigger conflict. And given how many people died in just the conflict over Tigray, this one, given that it would be international, has the potential to be even more deadly. So what exactly is going on? So the resolution to the Tigray conflict involved a peace deal that actually excluded Eritrea. And, well, I guess I should explain Eritrea. So what is Eritrea? Eritrea is a country to the northeast of Ethiopia. It actually used to be a part of Ethiopia. It was basically a province. But what happened is that there was I could go back a long ways to explain this. I'll go back to the 70s. In the 70s, there was a revolution. Communists seized power. I think they were officers in the military. They were called the Derg. And they tried to impose a authoritarian communist state on Ethiopia. As you can imagine, a lot of people were not gung-ho about that, and so they started fighting the government, and the result was a 10 to 15 year long insurgency / civil war, depending on how you want to define one or the other. And that ended in 1990, sometime in the early 90s. I want to say 1991, but that's probably not it. Early 1990s. And as a result of that war, the rebels that were fighting the Derg, again, the communists, in Eritrea, actually were able to successfully break their province off, seize control of it, and declare independence. Now, the new Ethiopian government that emerged after the Derg collapsed and other rebel groups seized control of Ethiopia did not recognize the independence of Eritrea. And even though they had a common enemy in the form of the Derg, they still disagreed fundamentally about what should happen with Eritrea, and the result was a border war. It didn't last all that long. I think it was like 6 months to a year or something, and it was over like this one small town. It was a very trivial conflict. It wasn't the Ethiopians trying to fully invade and conquer Eritrea, and it wasn't Eritrea trying to seize more territory. It was literally just a small border conflict over this one town that wasn't worth anything. I've heard it described as two bald men fighting over a comb. That's how irrelevant it was. But anyway, relations were bad for a very long time, correspondingly, and there was never any kind of finality to that conflict. They've basically been in a undeclared war since then. There hasn't been any fighting since there had not been any fighting since the late 90s. But there hadn't been any peace accord, and so it was thought that war could come again at any time, to the point where the Eritrean rebel government, I guess I should just call them the government, ended up creating a sort of Prussian-style authoritarian state in which all aspects of society were subordinated to national defense. I think one of the things they did is require mandatory service that lasts for 25 years, I believe, which is a very long time. Most countries that have mandatory military service require like a year, 2 years, something in that range. But in Eritrea, quarter century. And some people are basically there forever. It doesn't ever end. They're de facto slaves. the rebels basically became the authoritarian government they were fighting, but no surprise there if you're familiar with history. So the Eritrean government was sort of in this perpetual defensive crouch. Ethiopia didn't have to take it as seriously because it was much bigger. But there was always the threat that something could sort of spark a conflict that could spark a renewed conflict. So that lasted until a new leader emerged, that being the current sitting Prime Minister Abe. And he actually signed a peace deal with Eritrea. And for that, he and the leader of Eritrea received a Nobel Peace Prize. It's kind of ironic given what happened later, but say la vie. The guys that give out the Nobel Peace Prize have not had a great record over the past 20 years, but that's a whole other conversation. So skipping ahead, relations seem to be better. During the conflict with Tigray, Eritrea even actually helped the Ethiopian army fight the Tigrayans. So it seemed like they were in a good place. But over the course of the peace agreement that ended the conflict with the Tigrayans, the Eritreans were actually just excluded completely. And that created some bad blood. So that was kind of the first bad sign. The other thing contributing to the current escalation is that the TPLF, which is the party that had controlled Tigray province and, depending on who you ask, either started the Tigray war back in 2020 or had it imposed on them. Regardless, they're the ones that lost the Tigray war. And what happened after the war ended is that there was a split in the party. So there was a faction that supported the peace agreement and wanted to honor the terms therein, and then there was a militant faction that basically rejected it. And what happened recently is that the militant faction of the TPLF broke away and formed up some of their militias and attacked, I believe, a military base on the border. Oh, no, not a military base. It was a town, sorry. The town of Adigrad. And this was very close to Eritrea. And so the Eritrean government is a little concerned that maybe the TPLF is going to make some kind of play to start a conflict. To give you some background on that, the major provinces in Ethiopia have dominant ethnic groups in them. So Tigray province dominated by ethnic Tigray, Amhara province dominated by ethnic Amharans. Eritrea has its, I don't even remember what their ethnic group is. But basically all of these groups have territorial claims on each other. They both claim land that currently sits in the other's provinces. And there's been not inconsiderable conflict over that in the past. So the concern here is that the TPLF, or more specifically the splinter faction of the TPLF, might try to seize territory currently controlled by Eritrea because they think it belongs to them, and then in turn spark a conflict with Eritrea that might draw in the Ethiopian government. Because, of course, the Ethiopian government, while it doesn't really like the TPLF, also doesn't want to cede territory to Eritrea that doesn't have to. And if the TPLF starts a fight and then loses territory, that's basically what would happen. So the Eritrean government has mobilized its army along the border. As a result, the Ethiopian government has done the same. And the TPLF splinter faction is still running around, kind of causing trouble. So it's not certain that a conflict will break out, but there's considerable tension right now. Not least, even disregarding the TPLF thing, just the fact that there are, large units of two countries' armies right on the border with a history of tension and violence, that alone is reason for concern. But the underlying impetus just kind of adds to it. So that's what people in East Africa are kind of looking at right now. There's high tension. There's every possibility there could be a major breakout of conflict. And, given how deadly the fighting over Tigray was, again, this has the potential to be even worse because the actors involved have much larger militaries than the TPLF could bring to bear in 2020. It's also worth mentioning here that Eritrea actually signed a security pact with Egypt and Somalia. Now, I don't think it's a defense treaty. From what I was reading, it was just designed to boost cooperation for the Somali army to confront terrorism. So that's not quite the same thing as promising to defend. An attack on one is an attack on all, sort of a NATO-style Article 5 deal. That's not what that was. But it does illustrate that this conflict could blow out if it does actually break out at all, it could blow out into a general regional thing. Because again, Egypt has beef, so to speak, with the Ethiopian government. So if that conflict breaks out, the Egyptians may back the Eritreans and send them money, supplies, what have you, which again would make the conflict even more deadly than it would be otherwise. Somalia doesn't really have anything to bring to bear because it's a broken country and a failed state. But in so much as the Somali government can kind of legally give access to its territory and whatnot, they could act as a platform for Egypt to project power into Ethiopia in the event of a conflict with Eritrea. So, basically, 2 wars brewing in East Africa, in South Sudan and in Ethiopia, which have great potential to kill a lot of people.
Damn.
Not really great news. Also, an Ebola outbreak in Uganda, but that's that's kind of par for the course. It seems to happen every 5 to 10 years at this point. But it's not helping, suffice to say.
Yeah, most people wouldn't hope for one.
So that's where we are in Africa. The continent has definitely seen better days. Southern Africa, kind of more quiet. West Africa is still dealing with that ass. They really need to pick a better name. To be fair, in French it's fine. In French it's AES. I should use that, but it's a goofy coalition. They really need to change it. Anyway, that's still like the main drama there. But I don't think there's been a lot of developments recently regarding ECOWAS and the AES. So I don't really have anything to report on that count. Let's see, not much on Latin America. Colombia launched an offensive along the border with Venezuela. There had been an outbreak of violence, basically, and it got bad enough that the army had to be sent in. The question there for me was, how culpable is the Venezuelan government? The Venezuelan government kind of has ties to drug trafficking groups and rebel groups that sort of skirt the border with Colombia. So, not a lot of clarity on that. I haven't heard a big follow-up to this. It hasn't really gone anywhere that I know of either, so you can't really say it escalated. But I did think it kind of illustrated how lawless, I guess, certain regions of Colombia still are. Mm-hmm. To be fair, that's more the border of Venezuela than it is sort of the traditional suspects, sort of the areas where FARC used to be really active. I think a lot of those have calmed down. They haven't calmed down entirely, but my understanding is that they're much better. Mm-hmm. Other than that, the only other 2 notes I had on Latin America had to do with power outages. So there was actually a massive power outage in Chile some weeks ago. Pretty much the whole country was in the dark, from what I was reading. It's kind of surprising. Chile kind of is more it is more economically developed than most of Latin America. So I wasn't expecting to hear about it there. Now, the place I was expecting to hear about it was Cuba, and so that actually has happened just in the past few days. They had another big national power outage in Cuba that they're struggling to fix. That's been happening on again, off again for 6 some months now, so nothing new there. I could talk about Mexico, but I think everybody knows what's going on with Mexico. They're trying to deal with Washington and the bullshit they're in, so nothing new there. We've talked about that at length by this point. Let's see, Europe. You remember Belarus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, dictator Lukashenko.
Yep.
Been in power for decades now.
Didn't end up sending troops to back up Putin, but definitely is in Putin's sphere of influence.
Yeah, he's definitely aligned therein. So Belarus had an election this past month. You can probably guess who won.
Lukashenko?
Lukashenko.
Wow.
Another crushing victory.
Nice.
So that led to some countries in Europe, complaining about it, threatening sanctions, blah, blah, blah. But of course, everybody kind of knows at this point that Europe does not have a lot of leverage. They've already sanctioned Belarus as a result of its involvement in the war in Ukraine. So Belarusian government can kind of do as it will, do what it wants, without fear of, without too much fear anyway, of reprisal. Let's see. Yeah, Serbia. Serbia's been in the news quite a bit, actually. Let me see if I can find it. I had more stuff on Serbia that had more detail. Yeah, have you heard about this?
No.
There's been big mass protests in Serbia. It's the biggest in Serbia since the 1990s, when there were mass protests that overthrew the government of Slobodan Milosevic. I think the count for the protests this past weekend was something like 300,000 people.
Huh.
It's very high. The population of Serbia is only like, 10 million? So 300K, very strong turnout. So let's see. This has to do with let me try to get it right here. There was something that collapsed, and I'm trying to see if I wrote down what it was. Somebody in chat probably knows off the top of their head. It was some kind of like bus covering, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it in front of me. Basically, there was some piece of infrastructure that collapsed and killed some people. And the government denied culpability. They said it's just an accident, don't sweat it, shit happens. And then there were some new revelations that came out later that actually there had been a whistleblower who had said that, this thing, whatever it was, again, I can't remember what exactly, but they had said that it wasn't built to standard. And the government just kind of ignored that. And so that led to people making accusations of corruption and incompetence and the government not giving a shit about the people. And that spun out into major protests. Now, there's been intermittent mass protests in Serbia pretty consistently every year for the past 10 years. Basically, since Vučić has been in power. He's the current, I want to say, prime minister. I think the president is from a different party. Vučić is a nationalist. He's kind of associated with like the right-wing ultra-nationalists in Serbia. And then the president, if she's still around anyway, I believe she was a left-wing pro-European lesbian. So about as different a set of people as you could get, in other words. So a lot of people in Serbia don't like Vučić. They see him as being too corrupt. Maybe not necessarily too pro-Russia, but not sufficiently pro-European. And that's been sort of the impetus for the mass protests. However, Serbia is still a pretty conservative country, and that style of nationalism is still pretty popular. So even though there's been a lot of people who hate him, there's also been even more people that still back him. So what's new about this current iteration of mass protests is that they're focused much more on anti-corruption, or I guess I should say on government corruption, than they are on the specific politics of the government. Before people would protest about democratic backsliding, foreign policy, stuff like that. Now they're much more dialed in specifically to corruption. And that's a message that has much broader appeal because everybody suffers from corruption in Serbia. And so correspondingly, a lot more people have been willing to join the protests as the attention has shifted in that direction. And so that's brought more pressure to bear against Vučić than he's ever experienced before. And it's not entirely clear what's going to happen, but that has definitely been one of the big dramas in Europe over the past month and change. Yeah, the current protests are 4 months old, so they've been going on a while. The government, for its part, has basically just tried to ignore them. They've tried to deny responsibility. A couple officials have resigned, but overall they haven't really been willing to do much else besides. No, but the leadership hasn't offered to resign, and there hasn't really been much traction on concessions. To be fair to the government, the protests are very decentralized. There's not a central leadership. And so while that has meant that the government has struggled to kind of point to one person and blame them, which historically has been one of the main ways that they've discredited the opposition, they'll find dirt on some opposition leader and then use state-run media to kind of clown them. But because this is decentralized, they can't really do that. And so that's made it harder for them to try to discredit it and alleviate the pressure. So in so much as the protests do have demands, some of the ones that have come up have been releasing documents relating to the railway station. There you go. Releasing documents relating to the railway station disaster, prosecuting those suspected to have assaulted protesters over the course of the mass protests, dropping charges brought against students and university professors during the protests. It won't surprise you to know that student protesters are one of the leading groups pushing the protests. And also, there's been a demand for a 20% increase in the state's higher education budget. Now, again, there's no central leadership asking for this stuff. Actually, I think the protests are mostly being led by a committee of different people, and that committee has produced some of these demands. But it's not immediately clear if the government can negotiate directly with that committee. I think there was a bunch of drama within the committee about whether they should talk to the government at all, which kind of makes it difficult then for there to be any substantive progress. You kind of saw something similar play out with the Occupy protests back in the day. They were very passionate, but also very decentralized. And so there wasn't really anybody authorities could negotiate with. So there's something kind of similar playing out here from what I was reading. The protesters have a lot of support, but the government doesn't really have anybody they could talk to about what specific steps can be taken that would result in the protests going away. It's also worth mentioning here that even if the protesters get what they want, that doesn't mean that liberals in Serbia are ascendant. Again, the main reason the protests have been as successful as they have been is because the focus of the protests is not on liberalization, as they traditionally have been, but specifically on corruption, which is something people all across the political spectrum have an interest in. So the protesters could win this battle, but they would still not have won the broader war, so to speak, that they have been trying to wage against Vučić and his people to try to push Serbia in a more liberal direction.
And by liberal, you mean classical liberalism?
Classical liberalism, yeah. Not American liberalism. Different thing. Yeah, in Serbia, the issue isn't definitely the people who support liberalizing Serbia are disproportionately left-wing, but they're not fighting for the usual corduroy of American leftist objectives. They're fighting for political pluralism, rule of law, that kind of stuff, basic stuff, which some of that already exists in Serbia, but the institutions undergirding it are pretty weak, and the government and ultranationalists in general in Serbia have circumvented them as much as possible. Serbia is very much in the illiberal democracy category, along with countries like, Hungary, for example. So correspondingly, they do have democracy, but it's just not like a fully fledged liberal democracy as we would think of it in the West. This might be hard for Americans to understand because our democracy has been kind of sliding away from liberal democracy itself. And not everybody is entirely unhappy about that, regrettably. But that is roughly how the politics break down. So lots of drama in Serbia for the past couple months. There were also some mass protests in Slovakia against, I think he's the president, Fico. He himself is kind of a populist right-winger, but I don't think the protests there are mass protests like they are in Serbia. I think these are basically one-off protests that were called by the opposition, and I haven't heard any follow-up to this. This was, I think, some months ago. This is an older note. But Serbia and Hungary are not the only states in Europe that kind of have this tension between populists, the populist right, however you want to frame that, and then sort of establishment liberals on the other side. Let's see, there was a ICC investigation launched into the Prime Minister of Italy, Meloni. And that's not necessarily a big deal, because I think everybody knows that most ICC investigations just don't go anywhere. But in Europe, they take it a little more seriously. That's unlike the United States. You know, they actually, most states anyway, have it codified to some degree, legislatively. So in Italy's case, I thought it was kind of surprising that they did this. And the impetus here has to do with immigration. What had happened is that there was a Libyan guy that was wanted by the ICC because of alleged abuses perpetrated against migrants. Basically, this guy had run a camp in Libya which collected migrants trying to move into Europe, and also took on some migrants that had been captured by the Italian Navy and which were turned over to them. And the idea there is that the Italian government is trying to just inhibit the flow of migrants by kind of allying with proxies in Libya, you know, giving them money or whatever other favors they might want in exchange for cooperation on dealing with the migrant issue. So this guy was wanted. He was in Italy. He was detained by the Italian government. His name was Osama Najin, aka Al-Masri. I don't know what that means. He was, more formally, he was is the head of Libya's judicial police and the director of, quote unquote, a well-known detention center in Mitiga near Tripoli, end quote. Now what happened is that the Italians, instead of turning him over to the ICC, allowed him to go back to Libya. And the ICC was very upset about that, which is why they launched the investigation, because they suspect the prime minister basically tacitly wants this guy to continue to do the things, the abuses basically that the ICC accuses him of. And so that, of course, resulted in a whole kerfuffle. It's not a big story. Nothing's going to happen to Meloni. It probably won't go anywhere. But I thought it was worth mentioning to highlight how relevant the migrant issue still is in Europe, and that it still crops up in foreign policy. You know, again, one of the major foreign policy issues is the migrant issue in Europe. And the result of that is that European states will try to work with proxies in neighboring governments outside of Europe, or even with sub-national entities in neighboring countries like this guy. Because again, Libya is still kind of a failed state, so there's not really a real government that you can talk to. There's a couple governments that fancy themselves the national government of Libya, but it's kind of up to you as an outsider to pick and choose which one you prefer, as far as recognizing which one is the government of Libya. So Italy has generally worked more with the Tripoli government, and unsurprisingly, this guy, you know, has a detention camp basically near Tripoli. So similar cases with Turkey. Turkey is actually an even bigger partner as far as migrant foreign policy. The Turkish government takes steps to inhibit the flow of migrants through Turkey into Europe, and also has set up large refugee camps on its own territory to try to house and take care of these people. And they have made some bank on that. The Turkish government knows it has leverage over Europe because it does that, and so demands transfers of money and other favorable policies. And when Europe has done something Turkey doesn't like, they've pretty consistently threatened to open up their border again, unless Europe kind of adheres to their demands. So migrant politics, still a big deal, doesn't really surprise anybody, but I thought people might be interested in some of the details of that. Let's see, Brexit, the gift that keeps on giving. So this is another kind of minor note, but because it's a Brexit related, I thought people might be interested. There's going to be Brexit arbitration. This is something that I've been expecting for a long time, and I'm actually really surprised it's taken, 5 some years for this to happen. For those of you, this is probably like 99% of people listening, so for your benefit, the agreement that formalized Brexit, you know, the actual Brexit agreement that was finally negotiated, between the UK and the European Union was never really complete. There were lots of outstanding issues that neither side could really fully resolve over the course of the negotiations. And so the result is that they basically just kind of threw up their hands and said, fuck it. Instead of settling these outstanding issues in the negotiation, we're going to create a mechanism in the Brexit agreement that is going to be used to arbitrate these differences that we can't settle right now. And I think there was something like several dozen committees that were supposed to be set up in the event of a dispute over one of these unsettled areas that would then be responsible for arbitrating whatever kerfuffle, to use that word again, that came up because they hadn't fully resolved them. Now, I had thought that there would be a pretty steady drumbeat of exactly these kinds of arbitrations. I figured that once the Brexit deal was done, then they would actually start doing these arbitrations to hammer out all of the aspects of the deal, the sticking points in the negotiation that they hadn't been able to successfully foreclose on. And it didn't happen. Instead, the pandemic happened, and they kind of focused on other stuff, and then the war in Ukraine. So there's just been a successive of major events that have taken attention away from it. And as a result, it's been 5 years now, during which time there hasn't been, to my knowledge, any substantive use of these arbitration mechanisms. But it did finally happen. We do finally have one, and it has to do with fish. This was one of the issues that they couldn't really resolve. It has to do with sand eel fishing. Apparently sand eel is a type of fish. So, Britain, as part of Brexit, wanted to try to make sure that it retained exclusive rights to fish in its own waters. And Europe, for its part, wanted to try to negotiate at least some continued access to British waters for European fishermen. So they kind of went back and forth on it over time. They never really reached a fully satisfactory conclusion. And so as a result, they kind of left it to this arbitration mechanism to deal with it. And so now it's finally happened. They are basically going to bat over this. The UK has some rules in place that the European Union thinks is unfair. And so they're going to leave it to the arbitration mechanism to try to sort it all out. And depending on how that goes, we could see a model for how other issues like this that remain unresolved from the Brexit negotiation could go. So it could be the case that whatever the arbitration mechanism decides, whether it decides in favor of the UK or the EU, then both sides just respect that and go with it. That could be how the other issues are resolved. However, it's also possible that one or the other side rejects the decision by the arbitration and then tries to impose its own solution. The European Union has more leverage, so it hypothetically could do that, but the UK could just be stubborn and do it for political optics reasons. Regardless, that's entirely possible, and the result could be a kind of renewal of the Brexit negotiation, as horrifying as that sounds. If there is no real arbitration mechanism, which would effectively be the case if one or the other party rejects their outcomes, regrets the arbitration decisions, then we'll be back to square one, de facto. And they'll have to go back to negotiating bilaterally all of these different outstanding issues. So sand eel fishing sounds very boring. I know, it's not exciting. But it is a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, for the overarching British-European relationship. And so it could be worth watching for that reason, which is why I bring it up.
Chat saying that Iceland has the rights to a lot of waters.
Yeah, there was a big blow-up over that in the 80s. I think they called it the Cod Wars. So there was a bunch of... it got pretty violent, not like shooty violent. No kinetic operations. But Royal Navy ships would go into the disputed waters, and they would try to scare off the Icelandic fishing vessels. And they didn't want to shoot them, but the Icelandic vessels didn't want to leave. So the result is that they started ramming each other.
Bumper boats.
Yeah. So it got pretty intense in that sense. I think it was eventually peacefully resolved, but it does illustrate that, governments will take fishing seriously, even if it sounds goofy. even if it's small industry, even if it employs hardly anybody. It's an issue of national sovereignty, and so they have to give it outsized importance relative to its actual importance. Let's see. These are just kind of miscellaneous Europe notes. Sweden. So there was this is kind of a little bit convoluted, but there was an Iraqi migrant who traveled to Sweden. I think he was a refugee. I don't remember whether or not he was a refugee or just like a normal immigrant. But regardless, he was an Arab Iraqi guy, came to Sweden, and he became well known, this particular guy, I don't have his name in front of me, because he set fire to a Koran. You know, he was an atheist or something, and so he made a big deal about burning a Koran as a form of protest. Well, that guy, relatively recently, within the past few months, was assassinated. He was shot to death. And, you know, violence in Sweden is still relatively low, but it's higher than it used to be, and that's got a lot of people upset. You know, I'm sure there's people that will argue that crime in Sweden is out of control, and you know, keep in mind I'm an American. I'm not impressed. You know, I have to laugh at that because you know the rates of violent homicide in Sweden are just way lower than America. So you know, even if it's gone up a lot in Sweden, you guys will be okay. You know, that's not to say America is doing great or even necessarily okay, but civilization will continue even if violent homicides do increase. It is, I assure you, quite doable. I know that from considerable experience living in Dallas, Texas, which, mind you, used to be the most violent city in America for some time. We held the record for a while. So don't sweat it too much. You'll be all right. But regardless, this violence has upset a lot of people, and it has apparently engulfed this guy, you know, this dude. And so the question is, was this just like random crime, or was this like a targeted assassination? I think people are leaning towards targeted assassination, because there are some radicals in Sweden, generally themselves refugees, who take umbrage with people desecrating the Koran and insulting Islam and whatnot. But regardless, this has opened up sort of this reopened anyway, this wound in Swedish politics surrounding refugees and the crime issue. And the fact that, you know, the victim in this case happened to himself be a refugee doesn't really change the vitriol with which people have kind of come to resist further immigration. Sweden already has significantly reduced asylum offerings of asylum, refugees, etc. So that's definitely that's already happened. But this is kind of solidifying it. There's definitely more the government could do. Even if immigration has fallen, there's still the question of what to do with the people that are still there in Sweden. And some of the more radical actors have been advocating for radical solutions to that. I think remigration is one of them, for example. So basically just a very incendiary event that relates to a very incendiary issue in Sweden and Europe generally. Also in Sweden, and this is also relevant to that immigration issue, there's a mass shooting at a university. I don't think the shooter, though, was a refugee. Actually, the casualties were themselves mostly foreigners, mostly Arabs and Bosnians. So kind of a twist ending to that one. So let's see, that's Sweden, and then in Greece, this is another minor issue. So there's an island in Greece called Sortini, which is a tourist island, you know, like a lot of them. And the issue they had is that they had just like continuous earthquakes over the course of a week. And that's very unusual. Like even for the Mediterranean, which has its share of earthquakes, it was weird to just have them happen so frequently over the course of the week to the point where they basically just had to shut down the whole island. You know, the whole tourist economy basically ground to a halt because nobody could come, and then the people already there were desperately trying to leave. You know, it's not fun being on an island in the middle of the ocean that is just seemingly on the verge of falling into said ocean. So obviously, as far as I know anyway, the earthquakes have stopped, but I thought it was, you know, very unfortunate for an island for which the economy is entirely dependent on tourism, to have an act of God very seemingly specifically targeting them and their whole economy. You know, an earthquake now and again, manageable, but just like continuous earthquakes for a week, man, that's just really bad luck. That's God out to get you at that point. Let's see, I think we talked about Austria last time, so that's not really new. More car rammings in Germany. I think we've talked about that before. We talked about this a little bit. So in Germany, they have the new government. Well, they're trying to form a new government after the most recent elections. MERS and the CDU is going to kind of dominate that, or at least that's what expected. They don't have enough for a majority government by themselves, but they are most likely going to form a coalition with the SPD and the Greens. So some details on that. One of the big things that MERS wants to do, and one of the big things they've been negotiating as part of the coalition negotiations, has been a big increase in spending. So one of the things that MERS has been supporting at the European level has been an $800 billion European defense package. And then at the domestic German level, he's been supporting the removal of the famous German debt brake. If you don't know what that is, in the German constitution, there's actually restriction that the government can't deficit spend beyond a certain point. And that's been very controversial over the past couple decades, because there's a sense that Germany really needs to spend more on its own infrastructure, as well as just in general, in order to kind of balance out the European economy. Germany is like the leading Germany is the leading economy in Europe. But they export a lot more than they import. And so the criticism is that they need to spend more in order to kind of import more, and then by extension, rejuvenate some of the economies around them, which are much less, they export much less and import a lot more. And that's obviously makes it hard for them to kind of develop economically or even to compete with Germany. So there's been a lot of criticism of that. You might remember it from the Eurozone crisis. The conservatives in Germany have traditionally been very, very resistant to the idea of big increases in deficit spending, but that just makes it all the more notable now that MERS, the leader of the CDU at this point, has been backing exactly that. So let's see, some more details on the negotiations. There was an agreement made in principle with the SPD. They're going to, or at least they promised to, exempt defense spending above 1% of GDP. That is exempted from, deficit spending restrictions. They also have agreed to set up a 500 billion euro off-balance sheet vehicle for debt-funded infrastructure investment. That's a mouthful. Basically, they're going to set money aside to invest in special debt instruments that they're going to use to fund infrastructure. So infrastructure spending, in other words. And then another part of the agreement is loosening debt rules for German states. Germany's, I think their provinces, maybe whatever, Germany's states are relatively autonomous by European standards, but they themselves have very strict rules on deficit spending, so they're going to loosen those up a little bit so that they can invest in projects, probably infrastructure, but also welfare spending and other types of things like that that are relevant. I'm not familiar enough with German states to know what exactly they're responsible for in the context of German politics, so I can't really break that down in detail, but that is something that they want to do, give them a little more leeway so that they can spend on projects of special interest to them. Let's see. And then they brought in the Greens, so there's been more negotiations on that. So the final coalition agreement is probably going to look something like this: a big boost in defense spending, civil protection, and intelligence. Spending which, again, with spending over 1% of GDP being exempt from debt restrictions, that again. A special $500 billion thing for infrastructure, as stated. The new thing that came out recently is that 100 billion, euros, not dollars. The new thing that came out with regard to the 500 billion euro infrastructure fund is that 100 billion euros of it is going to be used to cover climate protection initiatives. That obviously is a give to the Green Party, which they're trying to get into the coalition. They've been kind of stonewalling on joining the coalition. So that money is what has kind of gotten them on board. Let's see. And then going back to the lifting of restrictions on states, German states will be allowed to borrow up to 0.35% of GDP above the debt limit, which isn't much. 0.35% is pretty small, but it's higher than what they could do before. So that should result in a little more government spending and correspondingly a little more fiscal stimulus. Let's see, and I had another note here that the defense plans also allow spending on aid for states, quote unquote, attacked in violation of international law to be exempt from the so-called debt break. So the debt break, according to these negotiations, may still stay in place, but there's going to be a lot of exemptions for defense infrastructure and potentially aid to Ukraine. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows they're talking about Ukraine there, so basically aid to Ukraine will be exempt from that as well. Now, I've also heard talk about changing the Constitution. That could be in the cards, so I'm not sure exactly how that shakes out. I had thought they were going to try to change the Constitution to remove the debt break, but looking at the coalition negotiations, I gather instead that they're just going to relax it a little bit. So this isn't going to be like a major change to the German Constitution, more of a marginal change. Its significance is more in the fact that they're doing it at all. Because again, that debt break had been like one of the third rails of Germany's politics. It wasn't something anybody could really fuck with. But now that's changed. Obviously, circumstances such as they are in Germany and Europe have necessitated some significant increases in spending. And so that's where we are. Okay. So Armenia and Azerbaijan, do you remember this drama?
Yeah, they've been fighting.
Yeah, that was the whole Nagorno-Karabakh thing.
Mm-hmm.
Armenians had that sort of bit of territory that had belonged to Azerbaijan, but which they took in the early 90s, and then it turned into a frozen conflict. And then in 2020, Azerbaijan just fucking invaded and took it back. So that was a whole thing. So they've been at peace since then, but it's been a very uneasy peace. And what's been happening recently is that they've been trying to negotiate an actual peace agreement to try to normalize relations. So there actually has been progress on that. They have actually recently agreed on the text of a peace agreement to try to end, their hostilities. Well, the hostilities have already ended. They have a ceasefire in place, but to formally end their conflict and hopefully, again, bring relations to something resembling normality. It's a little unclear what the timeline is for this, because allegedly, according to the Azerbaijan government, it's going to require changes to Armenia's constitution, because apparently there are some provisions in Armenia's constitution that refer to Nagorno-Karabakh, and so the Azerbaijanis want that to change. So changing a constitution generally takes time and is very controversial. So as a result, the Azerbaijan government is apparently conditioning further progress on actual signing and implementation of the agreement on constitutional change. So we'll see if that pans out. Interestingly, the Armenian government denies that's a part of the agreement at all. So I thought that was a little odd. I would guess that's because it's going to be controversial. Armenia still has the same government it had in 2020. It's still led by Prime Minister Pashinyan. And, he's a reformer. I think he's kind of a well-intentioned dude. But losing a war is never a good look. And he was in charge when they lost the war in 2020. And so lots of people, especially nationalists, hate him. A lot of establishment political figures of the kind that he replaced when he took power as a result of a mass protest movement. They obviously still hate him and have been trying to undermine him. So this guy is on very shaky ground. And so I don't blame him here for trying to deny a very unpopular provision in the peace agreement, even it actually exists, than maybe him trying to do damage control. I think he kind of inadvertently conceded that it is actually a part of the agreement by way of some of his actions here. He himself has said in recent months that the country's constitution needed to be replaced and has actually already called for a referendum to do so. I don't know if that referendum is going forward. There isn't any date for it anyway, but he is supporting that. So whether he thinks it's part of the peace agreement or not, he himself is advocating for constitutional change. And I suspect what he's doing then is that he's trying to couch that desire for constitutional change in something other than what is going to be a hugely unpopular peace agreement. So basically playing politics. Let's see. So the agreement also is going to prevent personnel from third-party countries deploying along the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's going to apply equally to, say, European Union countries or maybe NATO countries from deploying troops as peacekeepers, but it's also going to apply to Russian peacekeepers. And that's significant because Russia actually is allied formally by treaty with Armenia, something that a lot of Armenians are very angry about. You know, they were attacked by Azerbaijan, they asked for help from Russia, according to their defense treaty, and Russia just kind of shrugged it off. So that's not a great look for Moscow, and obviously very, very damaging for Armenia in the war. So the fact that Azerbaijan has been able to get the Armenians to agree not to allow Russian peacekeepers is a win for Azerbaijan, but it's not necessarily as big a win as you might think, because the Armenians are so mad at the Russians and don't really figure they're good for much anyway. Regardless, Russia's influence in the region is kind of waning here. There has been a kind of a downward trend over the past 5 years in the Caucasus. Georgia notwithstanding. Obviously, Georgia would be the exception in that regard, but even there, things can be very touch and go, depending on what dumb shit the government has done to piss people off. Let's see, and then another one, let's see, likely cover a European Union civilian monitoring mission. Oh, right, that's part of the aforementioned block on third-party countries. So one of the things that's going to be covered by that agreement not to allow third-party countries in, the Armenians are going to have to kick out a European Union civilian monitoring mission that was there to basically to monitor human rights abuses towards the ethnic Armenians that have been expelled from Nagorno-Karabakh. They'd been trying to track them. There have been people who had led the government in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was technically its own separate country. Some of the leaders of Nagorno-Karabakh have been detained by Azerbaijan, and there have been allegations that they have been abused, tortured, etc. So this monitoring mission had been observing that, as well as just the general condition of Armenian refugees flowing into Armenia from Nagorno-Karabakh. Part of the agreement is that they have to go. So that's a win for Azerbaijan. That's not going to stop criticism of human rights abuses in Azerbaijan or Nagorno-Karabakh, but not having guys on the ground actually talking with people, collecting information, etc., that does make it harder to make those allegations with evidence. And so in so much as that's the case, that's a win for Baku, so they can defend their international reputation and pretend like they're not doing what they obviously have wanted to do for some time. So that's not the worst possible outcome, but it is kind of negative, and certainly if you're Armenia, you're not feeling great right now. Romania, bizarrely, has become a talking point in the United States.
Oh, what did they do?
Very strange. Well, you might remember a couple sessions ago, we talked about how there was this guy. They had a presidential election. This was at the end of last year. They had a presidential election where the guy who got the most votes, a plurality, but not a majority, it was like 40%. But that was the most any candidate running got, but he came out of nowhere. Like a lot of people just didn't know who he was. Like people were even commenting online, like, wait, who is this guy? Mm-hmm. He had not even started running until like a month before the election. And most of his campaign was basically like TikTok videos. He had a social media ground game that was very strong. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, like people didn't really know much about him, but somehow he was able to get a good chunk of the vote. Part of his platform is basically just being an outsider. It's a very anti-establishmentarian type of platform that he has. Railing against the government, railing against elites, alleging corruption in government. He's also more pro-Russian, says Romania shouldn't be sending aid to Ukraine, needs to back out of the conflict entirely, cut all ties, et cetera, the usual stuff you would expect from a populist conservative in Europe at this point. So he won more votes than anybody else, and then I think there was some agency in Romania's government that alleged that he had broken some laws about reporting funds, that he had taken foreign funds from Russia, I think specifically, and used them to help fund his social media campaign, and done so without reporting it. And so for that reason, they actually canceled the runoff election, which had been scheduled, and launched an investigation into this guy.
Oh, no.
And so there's been more revelations, whatnot, et cetera. Supposedly, I think the most recent thing is that there was a political party that had been a member of the ruling coalition before the election, the National Liberal Party, I think it's called. It was revealed that they had actually originally funded the campaign in secret because they were hoping that this weird outsider candidate would basically bleed votes from their main rival.
Mm-hmm.
So they were kind of basically backing a small third-party candidate in the hopes that their opposition would lose more votes to him than they did, and in turn favor them in the election.
Makes sense.
The party denies that, and the PR company that had been contracted also denies it. Lots of asses getting covered right now, so who the fuck knows who's telling the truth, be it the government or this guy or the parties, whomever. But what they've said is that their social media campaign was hijacked, quote unquote. They say that the scripts they sent out to influencers were changed, and that basically this guy ended up being running a social media campaign much different than the one they had intended. The implication being that some kind of third part, presumably Russia, that's kind of the subtext here. Presumably some kind of Russian influence operation happened that hijacked the social media campaign, used the same hashtags, changed the scripts to influencers and whatnot in a way that changed this guy's campaign from something that it had originally been intended to be. Again, take that with a grain of salt. Everybody's probably lying at this point. But it was a weird twist to the story. So the most recent development was that this guy, what's his name? Let me see if I can find his actual name here. Georgescu. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but that was the presidential candidate. So he was under investigation. The most recent development is that he is now barred from running in the new presidential election, which they are going to rerun. They're not going to do a runoff. They're just going to rerun the presidential election entirely. And this guy has now just been outright barred from running, allegedly because of inconsistencies in the reporting of his funds that he is legally obligated to do. That is the technical reason. Oops. And the fallout from this, I had expected, would be mostly restricted to Romania, because people in Europe, and certainly not people in the United States, they don't pay much attention to domestic Romanian politics, in my experience. So you can imagine my surprise when J.D. Vance, among other people in the Trump administration, started bringing this up. They've started using this as an example of how Europe is turning against free speech, and how their democracies, if your democracy isn't strong enough to handle a TikTok campaign, then maybe it wasn't very strong to begin with. Those were the statements Vance made. That's me paraphrasing J.D. Vance's statements at the Munich Security Conference a while back.
Huh.
Yeah, so this has become like a talking point for the Trump administration now. I think they are trying sort of indirectly to support populist conservative movements in Europe, mostly rhetorically at this point. I don't know that they're actually doing much substantial to do it, but at least rhetorically, in terms of statements like the ones Vance made, they've come out and seem to be giving succor to them. And succor, I forget how to pronounce that, right? And so, as a result, Romania is getting more attention than it has historically for like the past 20 years from Washington. It's very bizarre. and I don't entirely know what to make of it. I think, for the most part, it's not something to be taken seriously because there's just an immense amount of cheap talk that comes out of Washington and from the Trump administration. So I don't pay too much attention to it. I think it's only really relevant in that regard in so much as it's part of a pattern of the Trump administration seeming to back populist conservative movements in Europe, which is a kind of political interference and does break with established diplomatic norms, especially those with regard to countries that the United States has generally considered an ally over the past half century. So to suggest that Europe is somehow not an ally because it's turning on our quote unquote common values, that is very strange rhetoric to me. It seems more like bullshit to me. I don't think there's much, if any, truth to that. But you could say that Romania, in barring this Georgescu guy from running, is restricting the choices available to voters. And I think I said even from the start that the whole thing was very shady. You know, the Romanian government itself still has a lot of political parties and people who retain ties, who have their political origin in the Romanian Communist Party. You know, the Romanian Communist Party actually never fully disappeared from the political landscape of Romania. They basically just killed their leader. That was Cusco back in the day. They killed their leader and then they rebranded. And then they tried to pretend like nothing happened. And they were actually pretty successful in that. They remained one of the major political parties in Romania. And in doing so, have been one of the more successful former communist parties in Europe, if not the most successful former communist party in Europe. So it wouldn't surprise me, given all of the corruption that they've been involved in, as well as, you know, other major political parties in Romania, if they were basically trying to unfairly restrict the voters' choice here in order to prevent a new rival from emerging. That is not outside of what would be normal politics in Romania. At the same time, the populist movement in Europe has issues, and I don't entirely blame the Romanian government for being deeply suspicious of them. You know, yes, the Romanian government has its issues with corruption, but at the same time, I don't know that populists in Europe have a great record over the past 20 years of actually fixing corruption. You know, looking at Hungary and Viktor Orban, for example, he made a big show of demanding accountability of the government before he got into power, or at least getting into power the second time. He was actually in power in the 90s, too. But, you know, before 2010, he made a lot of noise about corruption in government and how if people voted for him and Fidesz, then they would fight it, and they would progress the economy, you know, solidify the democratic transition. And then he gets voted in, and he just doesn't do any of that shit. It's just democratic backsliding, crony capitalism, like all of the stuff that he said that he was going to fight, he just kind of did himself. Mm-hmm. And that's a recurring pattern with a lot of populist conservative movements in Europe whenever they've gotten into power. So I don't entirely blame the Romanian government for that reason, for not entirely trusting these guys and for being very, very skeptical of, you know, giving them more scrutiny than they might get otherwise to their funding and all that kind of stuff. So I suspect where you fall on that is going to depend on your politics. And as we've said before on here, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. You know, you guys can kind of figure it out yourself. But the Romania issue has kind of blown up and been given like weirdly disproportionate attention because of this because of the new government in the United States and because of the pressure that new government has brought on Europe on account of its alleged turning away from free speech and the norms thereof.
Interesting.
Okay. How are we doing on time?
Hour and a half so far.
Hour and a half, halfway point. Okay. Yep. Yeah, we started a little late. I think, there was confusion about time zones?
Yeah, I put the wrong time zone. Oops.
It's all good. I've done it myself many, many, many times. Okay, Middle East. It's been some action here. Turkey. You remember the PKK? It's Kurdish separatist group fighting in Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so as we've talked about before, the PKK, they're fighting for an independent Kurdish state in Turkey, and in so much as they haven't been able to do that, they also have made demands, for greater equality for Kurds in Turkey, less oppression, more respect for the Kurdish language, etc., that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Ethnic movement, basically, of a prototypical kind. So the PKK, in addition to being that, is also very, very left-wing. It is kind of basically a communist or pseudo-communist political party ideologically. And their leader is kind of a Stalinist. He runs the organization very hierarchically, it's very top-down, and he has a cult of personality around him. His name is Öcalan, and he's run it for a long time, but over the past 30-some years, he's had to run it from prison, effectively. He hasn't really been in direct control of the PKK in a long time. But he still has revered status within the PKK, so his word still carries a lot of sway. And what's been happening for the past month and change is that one of the many nationalist political parties in Turkey, Turkey's political spectrum basically runs from nationalist to ultra-nationalist. There's not really a lot of political left going on there. So there's a whole litany of nationalist parties in Turkey. And one of them actually saw their leader meet with Öcalan in prison. And that's an effort because Öcalan is actually being held in a prison cell on an island. It's not a normal prison. They gave him a special prison just for him because they consider him so dangerous. So this guy traveled to the island and met with him. And apparently he wanted to negotiate some kind of ceasefire or even a peace deal between the Turkish government and the PKK. And that was a pretty notable move because normally nationalists in Turkey spend their time saying that, well, for one, denying that Kurds are some kind of separate ethnicity. I think they call them mountain Turks or something like that. But when they're not denying that they're a separate ethnic group entirely, they're generally asking the military to crush them, kill them, shut down their protests, that kind of thing, to remove their language from education, that kind of stuff, nationalist stuff. Mm-hmm. So for one of them to actually come out and ask for some kind of peace talks, very notable. Even more unusual is that it actually worked. Öcalan apparently has agreed to a ceasefire with the Turkish government. And he has actually come out and issued statements to that effect, asking the PKK, I guess technically ordering the PKK, to respect a new ceasefire that he has negotiated with the government. So that's a big deal, because the PKK has been fighting the Turkish government on again, off again, since the 1980s. If not the late 70s, so decades and decades. There had been a de facto ceasefire in place for a good chunk of that, but Recep Erdogan kind of fucked that up because he wanted to be president. It was a whole thing. There was a lot of conspiracy theories around it, but basically, my understanding is that Erdogan sabotaged the ceasefire deal so that he could destroy this Kurdish political party that was not allowing him to change the constitution so that he could become a president in a newly presidential system. And so that resulted in a resumption of the fighting between the government and the PKK. It was all very sordid. So after almost 8-some years, I guess, that happened in 2015, 2016. So I guess 8-9 years of renewed fighting now seems to be coming to a close, which everybody should be grateful for. That's actually good news. It's not clear what terms are going to be a part of the ceasefire, if there are any concessions that one or the other side is going to have to give. That's not clear to me yet. It may not be clear to anybody. They may not have published the details at all. But some progress there. And it has big ramifications, not only for Turkey, but for the region, the Middle East writ large. Because the PKK operates to varying degrees in multiple countries, not just Turkey, but also Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And the renewal of violence between the Turkish government and the PKK resulted in, for one, a significant uptick in PKK activity in those countries, and correspondingly, a significant uptick in Turkish military intervention in those neighboring states. And so the result has been a multitude of violations of the sovereignty of Turkey's neighbors over the past 10-some years, to say nothing of a not inconsiderable amount of political intrigue in those neighboring states, as the Turkish military and government have tried to influence various political actors along its border in order to try to prescribe the influence of the PKK along its border. So lots of drama in Syria, for example. Syria is the main one here. The Kurds in Syria and northeastern Syria formed their own militia called the YPG. And that became the leading military force in northeastern Syria. It later went on to become the core of a new group called the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was an umbrella organization partly created by the United States in order to try to incorporate the non-Kurdish population of northeastern Syria, which again was basically controlled by the Kurds at that point. So they wanted to try to meet the non-Kurdish population in the middle and ensure that they did not see the Kurds as like unwelcome overlords. Didn't really work. They still don't like the fact that Kurdish militias are kind of running their towns and cities, but it was an effort anyway to try to get around that. Now the issue is that the YPG has very strong ties to the PKK. Like they share a common ideology, they both revere Öcalan, they fought together. The YPG gives PKK fighters shelter. YPG fighters sometimes go over the border and fight for the PKK. Like they're very tightly linked. So the Turkish government is not being paranoid when it accuses the YPG of, supporting Kurdish separatists in Turkey. They do actually do that. And correspondingly, the Turkish foreign policy in Syria over the course of the Syrian civil war became more and more focused over time on containing Kurdish militias in eastern Syria. And more specifically, they focused on trying to push them away from the Turkish border by introducing Arab militias aligned with Turkey into those border regions. I think one of the famous ones was in 2018 when Trump had a phone call with Erdogan, and then after the phone call immediately withdrew American forces from the border area, as a result of which a whole bunch of Free Syrian Army guys moved in and then killed a bunch of Kurdish political leaders, etc. It was one of the more craven things that happened during the first Trump term back in the day. So that's an example of the kind of thing that Turkey wanted to do. That was their priority. Push the Kurds away from the border, diminish them as much as possible, restrict the extent of the territory that they control. There wasn't a whole lot they could do about a lot of eastern Syria because it was backed by the United States and the SDF. Trump phone call notwithstanding. But there are other areas controlled by Kurds outside of that area that the SDF technically controls, which are more controlled by the YPG. And those areas have been fair game. And so the Turkish army, as well as Turkish-backed rebels in Syria, have very frequently launched offensives against those Kurdish-held territories, which are basically just west of the Euphrates River. SDF territory and the territory that the US operates in, that's all officially east of the Euphrates. Anything west of that, that's in its own little separate world. So Kurds out there have very frequently had to fight against the Turkish army, FSA, Syrian government sometimes. Just pretty much anybody and everybody fucking hates Kurds in Syria. So they've ended up having to fight quite a few people. And that's continued even after the end of the civil war. In fact, one of the notable things that happened as the Assad regime was collapsing, and then in the weeks and months after, is that the Free Syrian Army just immediately started attacking Kurdish groups west of the Euphrates River. And that's been ongoing since then. So that's why the ceasefire that's another reason anyway, the ceasefire between the PKK and the Turkish government is significant. The YPG, as a kind of de facto extension of the PKK, may find that it is no longer under constant threat of Turkish attack. The YPG may be wrapped up in the overarching peace negotiations between the PKK and the Turkish government. And as a result, they may go much easier on them. Now, I haven't gotten to Syria yet. I had a bunch of stuff, updating on Syria, but one of the things that has happened that is probably related to the talks with the PKK is that the SDF has agreed with the new Syrian government to merge its military forces into the new Syrian army that is being formed, which means effectively that the Kurdish militias, the YPG, are going to disarm, or at least are going to pretend to. We'll see if they actually do. But regardless, that is a significant concession, and that does suggest that the Turks are going to be less paranoid going forward, because now all of these armed Kurdish groups, which are kind of sort of probably aligned with your main separatist Kurdish group in Turkey, are going to calm down, they're going to be disarmed, and are going to be the responsibility of the Syrian army again, or, well, the Syrian government, rather. Which you can apply pressure to as needed in the case that Kurds in Syria start acting up and doing things you don't like. Hypothetically, the new Syrian army being merged will deal with that themselves. So big progress not only for Turkey, but Syria as regards the talks with the PKK. Definitely some big strides towards peace in the region stemming from that. So let's see, a little bit of good news. Iran. I guess this is more weird news than good news or bad news from Iran. So make of this what you will. Had you heard about the 2 Supreme Court judges that were assassinated?
No.
Well, that was a thing, and it happened under weird circumstances. I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, the 2 judges that were assassinated reportedly had adjudicated cases of student protesters, artists, intellectuals, and activists in bench trials in the 1980s. This is back in the revolutionary period, in the 10 years after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the government was cracking down pretty hard on dissent. And there was any number of political dissidents that got wrapped up in that, were charged as traitors, and then killed. Just summary execution. Some of them were tortured for years before they were killed, but same fate, pretty much. So the judges that oversaw those cases have, as you might guess, very bad reputations in Iran, particularly, specifically, amongst Iran's liberal population, the anti-government guys, basically. They've had it out for a lot of these judges for a long time, as well as just, the regime generally, but these specific figures. So the reason they were assassinated probably has to do with that. It probably was some kind of revenge killing. Now, you might think that being controversial and high-ranking figures in the Iranian government, they would have bodyguards. They were killed in the, basically, the Palace of Justice, basically the main headquarters for the judicial branch in Iran. So how does that happen? It happens stupidly. So what happened is that the assassin, the guy who killed him, came unarmed, got into a fight with the guards outside the Palace of Justice, and in doing so, not only defeated them, but took their gun, and then used that gun to kill the justices before killing himself.
Whoa.
Yeah. That's about as hard as you can fail in terms of security. Like, if you're a guard, I would have a hard time thinking of circumstances where you could fail harder without you accidentally killing the person you're supposed to protect.
Mm-hmm.
So, lesson learned, guards in Iran are apparently pretty terrible at their jobs.
Well, as a note, there's the point of pay of, like, if you're being underpaid from what you feel like is the relative danger of your job, the willingness to exert effort toward it is also going to be low. Plus, there's just corruption and people who fake it until they make it, kind of a thing. So, yeah, wow. Unarmed person disarms you, takes your weapon, and then uses it. Jeez.
Not a good look. So let's see. Also, we've got a little bit of Trump stuff here. I mean, it's unavoidable. So one of the things the Trump administration did is that they sent a letter to the Iranian government basically demanding that they engage in negotiations over Iran's nuclear program. Mm-hmm. And of course, the administration did it in their prototypical style, which is very bullying. They basically said that if you don't enter into these negotiations, then we're going to attack you. And the response was not very positive, as you might guess. Specifically, the president of Iran, this is Masoud Pezeshkian. Again, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that right. He is actually himself more of a reformer, and he was only recently elected after the last president died in a helicopter crash. And the last guy actually was more of a hardliner. So you might think the reformer, or relative reformer anyway, would be relatively conciliatory in response to that. But, you know, nationalism being what it is, you kind of can't take that line down. So his response was to say the following, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want," end quote. And to follow that up, quote, "It is unacceptable for us that they, the US, give orders and make threats. I won't even negotiate with you. Do whatever the hell you want," end quote. So a pretty resounding rejection there. And it actually reminded me of something we were talking about a session or two ago. I think somebody in chat asked, you know, how do you deal with the Trump administration's theater? You know, if they're not really serious but make all of these threats to try to scare you into doing stuff, how do you deal with that? And the thing I said was to call the bluff. Basically just say, hey, you know, if you're going to do something, then do it. And what I mentioned last time is that most countries just can't do that because the United States has so much leverage over them that even if the U.S. administration doesn't do but a fraction, even if the administration doesn't carry out but a fraction of its threats, that could still do a lot of damage. And so the cost benefit doesn't really make sense for a lot of countries to call the bluff, even though that's what game theory wise they should probably be doing. So here we have Iran, which is in that position, electing to call the bluff. Now, it could be that there's negotiations behind the scenes. That's entirely possible. But the Ayatollah himself had come out earlier in response to an earlier entreaty by the Trump administration and basically said the same thing. You know, he had basically just rejected the call. And very specifically, I believe, if I remember correctly, he criticized the quote-unquote bullying tone of the U.S. entreaty. So I don't know that there's a lot going on in the background. This may well be an actual full-on rejection by the Iranian government. And so in turn, as the U.S. government might say, the ball is in their court. We'll see what they do with this. I'm sure they'll handle it with their usual grace and humility, but maybe we should just be optimistic and hope for the best.
Here's to hoping for the best, then.
Yeah. So snapback sanctions. This is the last thing on Iran. So if you remember the nuclear deal that was negotiated between Iran and the Obama administration back in 2015, one of the key provisions was a snapback provision. So the idea here was the sanctions as part of the nuclear deal would be dropped, or at least significantly curtailed. However, if insufficient progress was made over the course of the deal, and especially if Iran abrogated its obligations under the deal, then the sanctions that had been in place would immediately be put back in place. And the snapback, the significance of the snapback provision, obviously they could put the sanctions back in place regardless, but the significance of the snapback provision is that it allowed a legal loophole through the normal steps that would have to be taken to do that. Normally, if you want to put sanctions legally on a country, at least as part of like an international campaign of pressure through the United Nations, then you have to go through all of the procedural stuff you have to do with the United Nations to get the UN to sign off on it, legalize it, etc. And obviously that can take a very long time, especially if countries try to sabotage it. So rather than doing it like that, they had a specific legal mechanism written into the treaty that would allow the sanctions to be implemented immediately without going through any of the legal rigmarole of going to the UN and getting permission. Just according to the original UN-approved treaty, basically the counterparties, the parties that signed it besides Iran, can just implement the sanctions when they deem that Iran is violating the agreement. So that's the significance of the snapback. Now the thing is, the treaty as a whole, including the snapback provision, had a sunset provision. It was only for 10 years. And so it's been 10 years, right? The deadline is coming up this year. And what that means is that the snapback provision is going to obsolesce. And at that point, it won't be available, and they're going to have to go back to the drawing board if they do actually want to do sanctions. So the discussion right now is whether or not they should basically preemptively use it. Because it's pretty clear that Iran is not really honoring the agreement. You can argue that the reason they're not is because the United States fucked it up. There's probably a very strong argument to be made in that vein. But regardless, besides the United States, the other signatories actually had been adhering to the terms of the deal. And they had been asking over the past 10 years that Iran continue to do the same, regardless of what was going on in Washington. So the Iranians haven't really done that, and so that puts all of the other signatories in a bind. Because going forward, they're not going to have any of this architecture in place to use to pressure the Iranian government. So the talk now is that they should tell the Iranian government, hey, either renegotiate a deal or start adhering to the current deal, or we're going to immediately impose snapback sanctions so that we can use it before we lose it, in other words. So there may be drama initiated in that vein by Europe, for once, and not the United States, an unusual role reversal. Given that Washington is heaping pressure on Iran, returning to the maximum pressure campaign and sending catty letters to the Ayatollah, you could say that the United States is kind of playing the bad cop here. So that kind of opens the door then for Europe to come in, play the good cop. So maybe the European approach here could actually work in correspondence with the pressure from the United States. They could be the better alternative in the perspective of the Iranian government, and that in turn may incentivize them to be more likely to pick that route. But we'll see. The Iranian government is currently governed by hardliners. They have systematically marginalized the liberal opposition, and they've even marginalized the relatively moderate wing of the hardliners. There was a political spectrum even within that group, and even there, they have pushed out people that are seen as not being sufficiently pro-government, pro-revolution, pro-Islam, etc. So it's entirely possible that even if the Iranian government or parts of it actually do want to deal and think that's the best thing to do, it may be that groups like the Ayatollah or the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps could sabotage it and stop it from happening. And it's worth noting that that's relatively more likely now because both of those actors, the Ayatollah and the IRGC, have significantly increased their power relative to other institutional actors in Iranian politics over the past 10 years. The IRGC in particular has been hoarding more and more power within the government, getting more control over oil exports, getting more autonomy from the president, stuff like that. So if they want to sabotage it, they are in pole position to do so. And given how hard-lined they are and how mistrusting of Washington they are, that seems like a pretty probable outcome. So, more fireworks to come in that regard as well. Probably. We'll see. It could be very hard to predict given how hectic and unpredictable Washington is, as well as other actors, but the early signs are not good. So, speaking of signs that are not good, Israel. Let's talk about Israel. Always a leading contender for attention here. So I don't actually have that much, and we actually already talked about this a bit last time. The Israelis have been occupying the Golan Heights, or just living in them. The Israeli perspective is that they're not occupied; that they've basically just annexed them. So, whatever your preferred nomenclature. But Syria has always claimed them. Ever since it lost them, they've insisted that it needs to be returned to Syria eventually. So what Israel did when the Syrian government collapsed, the Assad regime specifically, they have moved their troops not only into Syria, but actually well into what had been a DMZ. Okay, let me reverse that. They have not only moved their troops into the DMZ that was supposed to be between Syria and Israel, they have moved beyond that into Syria proper. There we go. So there are IDF troops in southern Syria. I don't think they're very deep into it, but they have moved into it to try to establish leverage over the new government. And it's kind of put the new government in an awkward position because, of course, they don't want their sovereignty to be violated, but being a new revolutionary government that's just taken power in a country that's been devastated by a quite vicious 10-year civil war, they're not really in a position to do much about it. Now, the Israelis kind of have the high cards in that regard, but they themselves are in a somewhat awkward position because this is a pretty clear-cut case of them violating Syria's sovereignty. So they've come up with some after-the-fact justifications. The main one is that they're protecting the Druze. If you don't know who the Druze are, they're a sort of fringe religious group in the Middle East. They're roughly Islamic, but they're one of those sort of splinter groups that most Muslims don't really consider to be actually Muslim. So as a result, they tend to come under attack from radical Islamists, whenever they pop up. So the current government in Syria is technically led by a group that either had been or is, depending on who you ask, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, which obviously is disconcerting if you're Israel. And they say that that group is a threat to the Druze community in southern Syria, and that they are going to protect them. And they've been giving little goodies to the Druze community in southern Syria. They let one of the major Druze leaders cross the border into the Golan Heights. And they've also been hinting that they might allow Druze in southern Syria to cross the border to work in Israel, or the Golan Heights. It's, again, the same thing to the Israeli government. Which would be, a nice concession that would help them out, give them a source of revenue, especially given how bad the Syrian economy is. So that's basically the Israeli government kind of trying to bribe the locals in southern Syria to tolerate their presence. There is some reason for the Druze community to be concerned, given the nature of the new Syrian government. But that doesn't mean they're happy about Israel being there either. So the response to the Israeli presence has been very decidedly mixed, to put it mildly. But the Israelis, for their part, don't really care about that, because for them it's basically just a pretext. They want an excuse to intervene and to try to generate leverage against the new government so that they can get them to agree to do things they might not otherwise want to do. They haven't exactly been clear on just what it is they want the new Syrian government to do. The Israeli government has been notably bereft of demands in that regard, which I don't think is a very smart way to approach it. I kind of suspect Netanyahu just senses opportunity and is trying to exploit it without entirely thinking through how he wants to do that. But given how rough the neighborhood is, you can't entirely blame him for that. We'll see how it shakes out, but you do have the foundation laid now for a future confrontation between the Israeli government and the new Syrian government, which is unfortunate, because I think the hope after the civil war ended is that there might be a normalization of relations. Netanyahu does not seem to be interested in that, unfortunately. Okay, so speaking of Syria, what's been going on there? Let me get a drink first. This is going to take a minute.
You're good.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah. Final hour. And again, you don't have to do the full 3 hours if you get tired or want to break.
What about 5 hours?
5 hours. That's a bit long. You have quite the stamina, sir.
So the leader of HTS was declared president of the interim government. So no shock. And his responsibility, as stated, is going to be to oversee the transitional period, to oversee a transitional period to a new government. Now, some of the things they've been doing and some of the issues they've been dealing with. One, the new government has been arresting former Assad regime officials accused of crimes, one kind or another. Among these has included one of Bashar al-Assad's cousins, Atef Najib. He was a senior security official responsible for the 2011 crackdown on the Daraa protests, which precipitated the civil war. I don't know if you guys remember, but the civil war basically started when the government just violently cracked down on the protests in Daraa. So the guy that is partially responsible for the start of the civil war is now in custody. Obviously, a lot of people were responsible, but one of the guys most directly responsible has been detained. Let's see, foreign bases. So obviously Russia had some bases in Syria, and their fate has been the subject of considerable negotiation. since the civil war ended. The Russian government wants to keep them. The new government, not really so keen, for obvious reasons. Interestingly, I've read rumors rather, that the Israeli government is interested in the Russians maintaining a presence. They apparently see it as a kind of countervailing weight to the new government. I don't think that's going to work, and I don't even know. I haven't seen that confirmed anywhere, so I'm pretty dubious that's true. But I could see other actors in the region thinking that might not be a bad idea. And the Russians, for their part, have not fully evacuated their bases either. I've seen lots of evidence that they're in the process of evacuating them, but they do still exist. A final resolution of that remains to be seen. Let's see, so that's Russia. Turkey also has significant military assets in the country, and supposedly they're in the process of negotiating how that's going to shake out. Like, is there going to be a continuous Turkish military presence in the form of some bases somewhere? Is the Turkish army going to retreat to the border area to try to maintain some kind of de facto buffer zone? Or are they going to negotiate a full withdrawal? None of that is entirely clear right now. One of the things that has come up is a potential new agreement that would involve either a reduction or a redistribution, quote unquote, of Turkish troops in the country. What's meant by redistribution, not entirely clear, but full withdrawal is notably absent from that. So insomuch as that's indicative of where negotiations are, it seems likely that Turkish troops then will probably remain in Syria for the foreseeable future. And of course, the other major foreign actor with bases in Syria is the United States. And that also is, from what I've read, under negotiation. But unlike the other two cases, I haven't seen or read anything that gives any idea where those negotiations are. The most I've read is that the United States has played a role in the negotiations between the new government and the Kurds. I'll get to that in a minute. But beyond that, as far as a continuing American presence, not sure. We'll see. I imagine the Trump administration will try to get the U.S. out of Syria. That was actually a priority in the first term, but Trump ended up getting talked out of it, basically. So now he's back, and he's got sycophants and under him now, so they're not going to challenge him if he orders people to leave Syria. So I think that makes it relatively more likely. However, there is still the issue of the Islamic State. They still kind of run around parts of Syria. So it may be that there is some impetus to stay a bit longer, depending on how the new government shakes up in terms of its security forces and in terms of its ability to handle that non-state actor, that non-state threat in the form of the Islamic State. So, Kurds. What's going on with the Kurds? Already talked about the PKK and the ceasefire that they've agreed to with the Turks. Like I mentioned, the SDF has agreed to merge its forces into that of the new army being formed for the new government. And again, that is probably part and parcel of the ceasefire between the Turkish government and the PKK. And the United States has been negotiating basically on behalf, well, not behalf of, but has been mediating on behalf of the SDF to try to ensure the Kurds are well treated in the new government and basically have all of their rights respected and whatnot. Turkey is likely involved in that, I would assume. And so I imagine the United States is not only telling the new government that it needs to respect the Kurds, but it's also kind of implicitly telling the Turkish government that it also needs to do the same. So the Kurdish position in Syria seems increasingly secure, or at least as secure as it gets for Kurds in the region. That's not very secure, but there was an open question about whether or not the Turks and the new Syrian government might just team up to try to crush the Kurds. Given the Trump administration's previously stated desire to get out of Syria, it would not have been clear to me that the United States would have necessarily backed the Kurds if that had happened. So the situation was very fluid, but now things are getting more solid. It seems more and more that the U.S. is going to try to help out the Kurds, at least insofar as helping them means that we're going to secure some kind of place for them in the new government. Whether or not that entails full-on autonomy for Kurdish regions, I don't think that's as part of these negotiations. Thus far, these negotiations are just about whether or not the SDF will continue to be independent of the government and whether or not they will continue to be allowed to maintain their own armed forces. The answer in both cases seems to be no, but I would imagine there's some quid pro quo there in which their rights will be secured via some kind of mechanism. We shall see. So that's where the Kurds are, doing relatively well, all things considered. Integrating into the new army. So it's not just the Kurds that are going to be merged into the new army. It's also all of the other groups. And if you know anything about the Syrian civil war, you know that's a lot of groups. Basically, every town, every village in Syria formed their own militia to fight either with or against the government. And so as a result, there are as many rebel groups in Syria as there are small towns and villages. As you can imagine, that's quite a few. So what do you do with all these rebel groups? Well, the new government is trying to either get them to lay down their arms or to agree to incorporate themselves into the new army. There are some holdouts in that regard. There's a rebel leader in the south, apparently, who has refused the demand to submit his armed forces to incorporation into the army. And there's also been groups that are, also part of the merger into the army is going to entail the breakup of the units themselves. So this is actually these groups being merged into the army. It's not these groups being allowed to maintain their own commands, their own commanders, the integrity of their pre-existing units. They're not going to just take these units and then just allow them to exist under the army's chain of command. They're actually going to break up the units, break them up, break soldiers out of those units, merge them into actual new, presumably brigades, battalions, whatnot, and then also separate the units from their commanders. The commanders, I don't know if they'll be incorporated as officers or if they'll be just discharged and made civilians again, or how that'll work exactly. But it is an actual incorporation. They are disarming these groups and trying to get them into some kind of new institution rather than just sort of a new institution in name only. But there is one group that is holding out. I haven't read any update as far as other groups. But it is notable, I thought, that the holdout was in the south of the country, since that part of the country kind of had a very different experience to the north of the country. Well, I should say, let me rephrase, the rebels in the south of the country had a very different experience from the rebels in the north of the country. The rebels in the north got a lot of support from the Turkish government and army, and they were able to hold out for the duration of the civil war. They didn't control a whole lot of territory per se, but a good chunk of Idlib province remained under their control pretty much throughout. So they fared a lot better in that regard than the rebels in the south, which ended up getting steamrolled. They fought hard, long. Again, the revolution actually started in the south, so people there were very passionate about it. But ultimately, the army was able to defeat them. And it was able to force the rebel groups there to agree to peace deals that were relatively favorable. They basically allowed the rebel groups to continue to exist so long as they were loyal to the government. That actually ended up being part of the reason the Assad regime collapsed so quickly over the past couple months, because a lot of those rebel groups, when the regime started to collapse, basically found it very easy to reactivate and then just march on Damascus. As I recall, it was actually southern rebels that were the first to reach Damascus, even before HTS did. So those groups have an independent streak, basically, is what I'm saying. They're not really part of the same zeitgeist. That's not the right word. They're not really part and parcel of the northern rebel coalitions. They kind of have their own thing going on. So if there is significant tension in the new Syrian government, one of the fault lines I would expect would be a fault line between HTS and its coalition of rebel groups and a coalition of southern rebel groups. So the fact that there's a holdout in the south that doesn't want to allow his group to merge into the army and be disarmed, that's kind of an early red flag. It could be negotiated peacefully. Ideally, that will be the case, but we'll see. And that's definitely something I want to keep an eye on.
It's pretty wild to think about. There's so many different rebel groups, that it's more like the local people who are resisting rather than them joining some greater party, which is what you hear about a lot in history, like the Chinese Revolution, which is one huge entity, as opposed to like, welcome to your local town revolution. We're fighting the government too, but in our own way.
You're tempting me, Neuro. You're tempting me to go on a tangent about the Chinese Civil War. That's a deep topic. I'm going to resist temptation, but I just want to clarify. Yes, you're right that the Communist Party was a major faction, but it's just one of what had been many, many factions that came out of a period of immense discord and violence in China's early 20th century experience. The Chinese Civil War, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. The Chinese Civil War started in 1949. Basically, you could kind of say it dated earlier, 47 or World War II, but really it was ongoing for like 10, 20 years, going all the way back to the early 30s. But that civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang, that itself was part of a larger period of violence that actually started in, I want to say 1916. Basically, the warlords period, the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the emergence of the Republic of China saw the emergence of warlords all over China, and they all just spent the next 10, 15 years beating the shit out of each other. And they were not well organized. It wasn't the case that you had like one or two major warlords fighting for the future of the country because they had different visions. It was the case that basically every military officer from mid-level rank up formed their own band of warriors, their own war band, and then fought other war bands for control of territory, basically the right to extract taxation, to force women into prostitution, to sell drugs in a given territory. They basically started acting like gangs.
Sounds like Mad Max.
And so, sorry, what?
Sounds like Mad Max.
Yeah, well, that's pretty much what it was. It pretty much, during the height of the warlords period, it pretty much was Chinese Mad Max for an extended period, and it was a very difficult period for the Chinese people, unfortunately. But to get back to the point, actually, in so much as that was part of an overarching civil war in China, it actually did see an immense number of different groups, like in Syria. In Syria's case, it was more grassroots. It was more like individual communities kind of rising up and trying to either defend themselves or participate in the broader attempt to overthrow the government. In China's case, it was more elements of what had been the Republic of China army, or the Qing army, technically speaking, breaking off and just trying to abuse their authority. But there was a very similar fracturing, and you did see an immense number of different groups all fighting. So there actually are parallels there. So that's maybe not the best example for what you mean, but I do know what you mean. You are right that historically speaking, we think of revolutions and breakdowns of authority and whatnot, and civil wars as being comprised of maybe two or maybe three large factions that fight with each other, and that people join one or the other when they get involved. There's considerable historical precedent for that, but civil wars, even when that happens, generally involve considerable amount of civic discord, to the point that local militias rise up. Even if they don't want to participate in the fighting, local militias will almost always form just to provide defense for the local community. And from there, they generally get involved in things like drug running or other activities to try to fund themselves so that they can, maintain ammunition, weapons, etc., and sometimes also to hire mercenaries to kind of bolster their ranks. And then from there, they evolve into criminal organizations. That's actually where Italian mafias come from. There was a period of immense discord in Italy at the end of the 19th century when the different Italian states all tried to merge together in a series of wars, and those wars obviously were very destabilizing. And so local communities started hiring people to protect them from bandits. And those self-defense units became increasingly mercenary until they eventually just became what we now call the Italian mafia, extorting people for money, engaging in prostitution, drugs, etc. All of that originated as basically local militias defending local communities. You can see that too with the FARC in Colombia. Started out as left-wing revolutionaries fighting against the government, and then they became increasingly invested in just drug dealing for the sake of drug dealing. The source of revenue became the ends unto itself rather than the means to fund the ends that you were fighting for. Anyway, just a minor correction there, a little elaboration.
No, I appreciate that.
Let's see. Government. We already talked about the clash. The past couple months since the Civil War rather, has ended, has seen intermittent clashes between the new government and some groups, mostly Alawites, sometimes Druze, basically religious minorities that are not entirely comfortable with like an Islamist HDS government, as you would expect. Generally, they're mass protests. Occasionally, they have been violent. Mostly, they've been centered exactly where you would expect them to be, the major cities, where people tend to be more secular, liberal, etc. So Homs, Aleppo, or what's left of Aleppo anyway. And then also in the province of Latakia, which is the homeland of the Alawites, which is the big minority in Syria. The Alawites protesting is particularly sensitive because they are perceived in Syria as having backed Assad during the civil war. And so there's a particular fear in the Alawite community that they're going to be the targets of reprisal killings for having backed the losing side in a civil war. Thus far, there hasn't been a whole lot of that, but there has been an uptick recently. There was, I think we talked about it last time, there was a ambush, they were going to arrest this guy who had been part of the Assad regime. The force that was sent to arrest him was ambushed, and that resulted in a whole series of reprisal killings by forces loyal to the new government. And from what I was reading, it was several hundred, maybe up to 1,000 people that were killed as a result. We're still kind of trying to figure it out. And the killings were gruesome. Like sometimes they would just wipe out whole families. So it's not like it was low-key violence. They went hard. They went full reprisal killing. The government eventually did step in and stop it, because not all of... again, it's a revolutionary government, so everything is like very unclear and informal. Okay. So they do have nominally a new army, but the chain of command is not entirely clear, and a lot of the forces that are working for the new government are not so much extensions of the government as they are paramilitary forces aligned with the government. So they'll take orders from the government, but sometimes they'll also just take the initiative and do stuff on their own, and that's apparently what happened in Latakia. A lot of the guys doing the killing were supposedly, from what I've read, foreigners. They were not Arabs from Syria, but rather were Uyghurs and I think also Uzbeks. Those were the two groups specifically I saw mentioned. So until they're able to kind of tighten up their organizational chart, there's probably going to be more incidents like this, I would expect. But anyway, yeah, the killings have stopped, but everybody is very upset. Interesting trivia. One of the things that happened as a result of the killings is that a whole bunch of people in the Alawite community in Latakia actually fled to the remaining Russian military bases in Syria. That was basically their way of taking shelter, since obviously the Russian military is not invested in seeing them get killed. So Russians doing something useful. Give credit where it's due. It doesn't happen a whole lot these days. Let's see, most recent news. The president of the new government announced the formation of a 7-member committee that is going to be tasked with drafting a new constitution. And that's going to serve, quote, as the legal framework regulating the transitional phase, end quote. So this is not meant to be like the final constitution that Syrians are going to live under. This is more like a transitional constitution that's going to lay out a legal framework for how the interim government is going to operate. So 10 days after that announcement, there were some new developments. Let me just kind of go through them here. One, the president signed a constitutional declaration covering a 5-year period. So this is, again, is just a temporary constitution, 5 years, then it sunsets. The document itself that was drawn up says very explicitly that Islam is the religion of the president. That's totally expected, but actually it's it was the same in the Assad government. The constitution of Assad Syria also said that. So this actually isn't a change. This is more just continuation. Now, however, one change is that Islamic jurisprudence is going to be, quote, the main source of legislation, end quote. That's as opposed to a main source of legislation. So one word difference, a versus the, but they're really emphasizing Islamic jurisprudence here. Again, not surprising, HTS was an Al-Qaeda affiliate, they're Islamists, so Islam is going to be a big part of the new government, pretty much regardless of what happens. Let's see, also the document enshrines separation of powers and judicial independence. Again, according to my notes. Whether or not they actually follow through with that is going to depend on whether or not the people responsible for actually manning those institutions refrain from abusing them. That's always a heavy lift in a new political system that's being set up. But it is at least a little heartening to see that they're making a token, making a nominal token effort here by putting it in the new temporary constitution. The new constitution also guarantees women's rights, freedom of expression, and media freedom. You can put a big fat asterisk next to women's rights because they're going to define that according to Sharia law. So not women's rights as you might think of them, but they are making a nominal commitment here that is in accordance with their own ideology to protect women. So a little bit of credit there. I have to give them that. They didn't have to do it. The Taliban did not do that. The Taliban didn't do shit for women. The Taliban's attitude towards women when they finally took control was, you should consider yourself lucky we don't beat you. That was their big concession. So props to the former Al-Qaeda affiliate for at least pretending it cares about women here. Okay, let's see. So the president is going to have exclusive executive authority during the transitional period. However, they made a note that the president would only have one, quote unquote, exceptional power, and that's the ability to declare an emergency. So that is a small concession. They could have just given him emergency powers for the duration of the transition, but they are making an effort here to try to restrict his powers. Hypothetically, he could easily just declare an emergency anytime he wants. But for the moment, they're suggesting here that they are not going to do that. They're suggesting here that they're going to try to stick to a non-emergency framework. So assuming that is actually what happens, credit, again, credit where credit is due. They're going to create a new People's Assembly, which will have the full responsibility as the legislature, basically. It's not going to be fully elected. They're basically going to have to wait for the 5-year transition to finish, because that's about the time it's going to take to finish drawing up an actual final constitution and then vote on it. So it's presumably the new constitution is going to elaborate all the details of what kind of legislature they want to have. So until then, they're going to have a temporary legislature. 2/3 of it will be appointed by a committee selected by the president, and then the other third is going to be chosen by the president himself. That seems like a weird choice to me. I mean, if it's 1/3 I pick and then 2/3 a committee of guys, oh, by the way, the committee is guys that I picked. That seems very circuitous, unnecessarily so. It seems like there should have been maybe some process by which you take other major leaders in the government, major leaders of rebel groups, and try to have them form a committee that appoints people to the legislature. But instead, they're going with this. So I kind of take points off for that. That seems a little authoritarian. It seems like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. I want to appoint all the people on the legislature, but I don't want people to blame me for it. So I'm going to have a committee, quote unquote, that does it in my stead. So that's not great. I don't particularly approve of that, but there are other good signs, and honestly, my expectations for a former Al-Qaeda affiliate are on the floor. So the fact that they're not just going full Taliban immediately out of the gate, that does suggest there is at least some credibility to be had here for their claims that they're going to run this differently than Afghanistan. Let's see. Also, they're going to form a committee which will be tasked with drafting a new permanent constitution. So again, that's them prepping for the end of that 5-year transition. So that's the Syria update. Some positive moves, some violence. Nothing has broken irretrievably yet in the transition process. So things are more or less on track. This is pretty much what everybody was expecting. So nothing too dramatic to report in that regard. East Asia. Do we want to do East Asia? Do we have time?
About half an hour. There were some questions as well, so.
Oh, okay. Well, we can delay East Asia. I don't think I had too much on it anyway. It's just the National People's Congress. We haven't talked about DeepSeek yet. That's so funny. Korea. Yeah, we could, questions is fine. Let's take a look. I have to find it. Here we go. Okay. Oh, speak of the devil.
Is it an East Asia question?
It's an East Asia question.
Nice.
Do you have insight into what's going on in China right now? I haven't heard much about it. Well, yes, I do. I mean, that's such a broad question, though. I mean, there's so many directions you could go, like, in terms of foreign policy, domestic policy, in terms of managing the economy, in terms of the economy itself, in terms of just recent stuff that's been happening with the National People's Congress. Like, what direction do you want to go in? If I had to summarize, and I guess I do, what's going on in China right now is that their economy is struggling a bit. It's not collapsing, it's not struggling a lot. It's struggling a bit. It's kind of like, it's somewhere between stagnation and moderate growth. So not terrible, but not really good enough. And it does need to be good enough because China needs to generate enough jobs for all of the people that graduate from its schools, its colleges, etc. It needs to generate enough growth to generate jobs in general for its population, and it's not really doing that right now. Youth unemployment is like around 20%, probably. It's a little hard to tell because they decided to stop publicly reporting that particular data point. You know, they reported that it was higher than expected at 20%, and then they said, oh, damn, we're not going to report that anymore. So that makes it a little hard to judge whether or not there's been improvement. But given that there hasn't really been a significant uptick in growth since then, it's probably pretty close to the same. They're probably not doing great. So that's the main thing that the Communist Party of China is focused on right now. You might think they're focused on Trump and trade, reconquering Taiwan, subverting democracy overseas, backing Russia. Not really. That's kind of on the agenda. That's all stuff that they're interested in. But the main thing they're interested in is preserving their own power. And the biggest threat to their own power, as they perceive it, comes from people unhappy about the economy. So that's priority one. That's what they were talking about in the NPC, the National People's Congress. If you don't know what that is, that's China's legislature, which, as you might guess, doesn't really have a lot of power, but every year they meet and then they rubber stamp all of the party's priorities. And so you can get an idea of what the party wants to prioritize by looking at what gets the rubber stamp. So people pay attention to it for that reason. So the main thing that was discussed was the economy, unsurprisingly. And if you want, we could get into the Chinese economy and what's been going on there, some of the details in that regard. But as far as what's going on in China, that's what's going on. They're dealing with the economy's struggles. Beyond that, there's not a whole lot new happening. I don't think they're making big plays overseas. They're not really competing with the United States at this point. I think I've said before, kind of half jokingly, that Sino-American competition is fake. But it actually kind of is. Because right now, China and the United States are not really in a race to see who can dominate the world so much as they're in a race to see who can collapse first. Like, both governments are really struggling right now with internal domestic things, and neither one is doing especially well in doing so. So it's a race to see who can fail first and who can fail harder. And that isn't really what I think people think of when they hear about Sino-American competition. You know, when they hear about it, it has to, they hear about technology and trade and the Belt and Road, and you know, that stuff is there, but it's less relevant than it used to be, and it's not really a priority for either government. So they do make efforts in that regard, but it's not nearly as big a deal as people have made it out to be. So again, we can get into the details on the economy if you want, but roughly speaking, like, big summary, short summary, that's what's going on in China right now. Let's see. Recently, many of the protests I see in the US appear to have handwritten signs. Know exactly what you're talking about. Appear to have handwritten signs instead of the professionally printed and framed signs that were commonplace in the past. I noticed this trend does not appear to have taken place in Europe, but puzzlingly, I do see that trend showing up in Australia. Do you have any speculations on what may be going on and why the US and Australia protest signs are affected, but European ones are not? I'll preface this by saying that this is not a trend that I've noticed, so this is news to me. I think if I had to guess, it would have to do more with the who's organizing the protests, because in Europe, political parties have much stronger ground games. Like, they have a much more prominent grassroots, visible position in local communities. So, like, this is going to sound weird, so bear with me, but maybe some of you remembers the Anders Breivik shooting in Norway some years ago, where they had that far-right radical go to a camp and shoot up a bunch of kids. Mm-hmm. It's like 50 kids that were killed. So, you know, terrible tragedy, etc. But the camp itself was actually a camp that was set up by the major center-left political party in Norway. And that actually kind of caught my eye when I first read the story, because Democrats in the United States, and also Republicans for that matter, really don't have an equivalent to that. Like, you don't go to summer camp for Democrats or for Republicans. I'm sure there's like somebody somewhere that has something close to that, but in so much as there are like politically salient summer camps, they're almost never sponsored by one or the other major political party. They're generally sponsored by some kind of civil society group, like the NRA, or for example, I'm sure the NRA sponsored something like that, but not so much the Republican Party. So in the United States, we have strong civil society groups, and you know, in Europe they have them too, but political parties, by contrast to those in the United States, are much stronger than American political parties. You know, they're much stronger entities in terms of how much outreach they make to local communities and in how much they actually engage with people at a local level. Political parties in the United States don't really do that. Political parties in the United States are really more just vectors for civil society groups to operationalize their influence into policy action. In that sense, civil society groups are actually much more important. That's not to say that there are not political actors that are pretty much exclusively operate within political parties. You know, politicians in the United States famously can stay in power for like years, decades, whatever, and basically become institutions unto themselves. But again, I'm comparing to Europe. Relative to Europe, politicians and parties in the United States are much weaker. Civil society groups are comparatively much stronger. So I think that might be a potential explanation, if you like, for why this dynamic you've observed is happening. I would expect more organized protests that are backed by a major institutional actor to have better signs, I guess. You know, they're more organized, they would probably have better signs that have better messages and are just more professionally made. And in Europe, that's generally because a major party backed them, or a union, or another like-minded group. In the United States, civil society groups can organize protests, but generally they tend to be more spontaneous or decentralized. And correspondingly, it's more just kind of people on their own doing it. And as you might expect, people operating on their own are going to exhibit a pretty wide variance in terms of competence, their ability to make a effective, succinct, and attractive political sign at a protest. Some people will be very good at that. Some people will be very, very poor at it. So that's my crack at an explanation. Again, I haven't really seen this or observed it, so I'm not really sure if it's a real thing, but in so much as it is, that is a potential explanation. That is a difference between US and European political parties. As for Australia, no idea. Because Australia actually does have stronger political parties. I think they're still weaker than those in Europe, but stronger than the US. So I would expect them to have better organized protests. So if they're doing it too, then I don't have anything for you. So I guess the real answer is I don't know. A lot of noise to get to I don't know at the end.
Appreciate your honesty. There's a lot we don't know.
Let's see. Given the increased activity by China and Thailand to deal with human trafficking coming over the Myanmar border, does it look like China and Thailand will start cooperating to deal with the Burmese human trafficking rings? And is the U.S. involved in the increasing enforcement actions being taken along the border? I don't think the U.S. is involved. I haven't read anything to that effect. I don't think Washington really gives a shit. It's, it's not their problem. It's not Americans who are being tricked into being slaves for organized criminal groups trying to engage in telemarketing scams, which is basically what they do. So long as that's the case, Washington probably is going to take a back seat, especially given that Trump is in power again, because famously he has a very, very narrow frame of mind, narrow focus as far as what's a priority in American foreign policy. So no, I don't think the U.S. is involved. Will there be more cooperation between China and Thailand? I don't think there will be more, because there's already a fair amount. Because neither Bangkok nor Beijing are especially interested in not dealing. I mean, both Bangkok and Beijing are interested in dealing with the problem, and already have been. So I don't know that there's a lot of room to significantly increase cooperation. There's probably more they can do, but they're probably about where they want to be in that regard. Thailand recently has been bringing, you mentioned it yourself, Thailand is bringing more pressure to bear on the Burmese groups and whatnot. So I think that's already something that's just been happening. I think Thailand recently, for example, shut off electricity to Burma. Well, let me elaborate. A good amount of electricity in Burma is actually imported from Thailand. And the Thai government has been very selectively shutting off power that goes to very particular towns and areas of Burma where organized criminal groups have set up these telemarketing centers, scam centers. And the idea is that without power, then they can't, get onto the internet, scam people, make phone calls and scam people, that kind of thing. Interestingly, they've actually been getting around that in Burma by using Starlink, which has led the Thai government and the Chinese government to kind of hector Elon Musk a bit, demanding that he, shut off usage of Starlink in very particular areas. But they say they can't really do that, so it's kind of turned into a back and forth. And they can use Starlink without the power because they have power generators, of course. So, but anyway, the point is that Thailand is already kind of on its own, taking action to try to deal with the issue in Burma across the border, because it does affect them too. And most likely, I would expect they've already been in contact with authorities in Beijing on that. They're probably already sharing information and kind of coordinating in that regard. So I don't think there's going to be an escalation, because that implies that, I don't think that there's going to be an escalation in cooperation, because I think that implies that there was not already a lot of cooperation. And I think there really has been, at least as I understand it. You guys really like Burma. I applaud that. I respect that. Any updates on the civil war in Myanmar? Once again, I'm afraid that I don't have anything. I haven't heard any updates. There's generally not a lot of updates that come out of Burma, because generally news agencies don't have people on the ground there. If you're going to see an update, it's going to be from like the International Crisis Group, maybe an article in the Diplomat, stuff like that. And even then, they're generally not going to have a lot to say as far as new stuff happening. Generally, my experience with the civil war in Burma is that there's not generally a major development any more than once every couple months. Doesn't mean there hasn't been periods where they were more frequent, doesn't mean there hasn't been periods where they were less frequent, just that it's pretty rare to see major developments on the ground there. Now, that doesn't mean nothing's happening. Again, the issue is that there's just not a lot of people on the ground reporting it for an international English-speaking audience, which is, me. My sources just don't really cover it that much because they're dependent on one of the few local sources that do, and they don't report much, and when they do, it's generally that things haven't changed. That the front line moves a bit in this direction, this town falls, something like that, but the overall trajectory hasn't changed much. That's generally what I read when I read about Burma, which is why I don't talk about it more often, because you would probably find it pretty boring, most likely. But overall, the situation is still positive. The rebels have taken considerable amounts of territory. They still haven't managed to penetrate the core of the country where most of the population lives, and where the government is still sort of strongly embedded. But there has been progress made in that regard. And organization has improved. The People's Defense Units have gotten stronger. I think the only issue right now is that the rebels are very fractured. That's not really surprising. The PDFs, I forget what they're called, People's Defense Front, which is like the people from the center of the country, the ethnic Burmese, kids, young people generally, who left for the countryside when the junta seized power, or more accurately, ended the democratic government. They basically already had power. A lot of kids ran for the hills and declared that they would fight the government to try to restore democracy. So that's basically what the PDFs are. But then there's a whole bunch of ethnic militias that also have always been on bad terms with the government, in some cases for more than half a century. And they also have been fighting the government as part of the civil war. Some more strongly than others. Some had arrangements with the government that predated the civil war. Others are more interested in consolidating their power within their own region and not necessarily interested in fighting the government and overthrowing it. But there has been a lot of the major successes the rebels have had against the government have been in the form of ethnic militias launching offensives here and there. So the Arakan army in the west of the country, they've been in the news relatively frequently because they've taken so much territory. Rebels in the north have been responsible for training PDFs. They also banded together in the famous Three Brother Alliance to seize control of what had been a government-controlled town, which had been generating a lot of revenue for them by way of scam centers. It had become a hub for scammers from China to come and just call people, try to steal their identity, that kind of thing. So the rebels got together, successfully took that, partly with the backing of China. So, that ethnic militias have played a significant role in that regard. The PDFs are more the ones that are picking at the edges of government-controlled territory in the center of the country. And while they haven't necessarily taken a whole bunch of territory doing that, they have experienced relatively steady progress over time. And they have bolstered their ranks. People defect from the army pretty frequently. They're getting there. So, again, it's mostly, I don't want to say stagnant, but just changes of the front lines are just so slow that reporting them in any given month doesn't really mean anything. It's not going to excite anybody. So I'm glad people are still paying attention to it. Rebels in Burma, at least the ones that want to restore democracy, are definitely worth everybody's support. But there probably will be an unholy mess if they ever actually do overthrow the government. All of the ethnic militias are not going to be interested in giving up their power for nothing. In fact, I was talking about it before, right? Rebel groups that start out as rebel groups, but then just kind of devolve into criminal organizations that are more interested in power and money than any kind of cause. Generally, in situations like the one Burma is in, you see lots of examples of that. So I suspect the ethnic militias in particular will be doing that. Maybe the PDFs less so, since they're probably going to inherit the government if it does actually fall. But they're going to end up probably having to confront the ethnic militias sooner or later, specifically for that reason. And that's all we had for questions.
Thank you, chat, for your questions and your interest in world discussion.
So how much time does that leave us?
A crisp 10 minutes.
A crisp 10 minutes. Okay. Well, we never even got to Ukraine this time. I'll try to do a quick Ukraine update, in so much as that's possible. So Marco Rubio met with Ukrainian officials in Saudi Arabia this past week. I think that was Monday, Tuesday. And his position was that he wanted to know what concessions the Ukrainians were willing to make, which I thought was weird. Generally, you want to coordinate more on that, but whatever. You know, the U.S. is pretending to be a mediator here rather than like one of the parties that's invested in one side over the other. So in that sense, it kind of makes more sense. But given that the Russians insist that the United States is de facto at war with them, it's a weird look. Anyway, so the update to that, Ukraine is eventually did agree to a prospective 30-day ceasefire. That's been one of the things the Trump admin has been pushing. We're going to get a ceasefire, blah, blah, blah. Ukraine had been very reluctant, but meeting with Marco Rubio in Saudi Arabia, it was finally announced that the Ukrainian government is willing to accept and honor a 30-day ceasefire if the Russians do. And that, of course, is a big if. And so the U.S. representatives then said, quote, "The ball is now in Russia's court," end quote. Donald Trump himself told reporters that he would be open to inviting Zelensky back to the White House again after the talks in Saudi Arabia, so that suggests that relations there are probably back on track. It's notable that one of the concessions the United States made in order to get the Ukrainians to agree to this was that they agreed to resume U.S. intelligence sharing and security assistance to Ukraine. So all the big drama, you know, from a couple weeks ago about the U.S. cutting off intelligence, ending aid, et cetera, as I predicted, not to toot my own horn, but as predicted, that ended up going away. It ended up being kayfabe. So everything is kind of reset now, like an episode in a serial TV, in an episode of a serial TV show. However much drama happens, everything always resets at the end. So we're kind of on our way there now. Assistance has resumed. Donald Trump is saying nice things again about Ukraine. The minerals deal was not part of the talks in Saudi Arabia, but it has been mentioned off and on by officials in the admin. So that's probably going to come up later. They were making noise that it would be signed next week, but then that kind of came and went. So it's not really clear where that is. Doesn't really matter. As previously discussed, it's a bullshit agreement that doesn't actually have much to do with minerals. And it was probably just engineered for theater anyway. So it may be that that just disappears and people forget about it. Just as a side note, it's been killing me reading reports from think tanks and updates from outlets that focus on Eastern Europe, because they've been taking that mineral agreement dead fucking serious. And it kills me because, you know, even if you read the details of it in those reports, like, you can tell it's bullshit, but they insist on it. Anyway, that's pet peeve. That's been driving me crazy the past 2 weeks. The U.S., for its part, wants an immediate ceasefire, which would then be followed by substantive peace negotiations. That is basically the official U.S. position at this point. Ukraine, of course, is interested in the ceasefire and substantive peace negotiations, but is very, very skeptical that Moscow is interested in really either of those things, certainly not substantive peace negotiations. So Russia, for its part, oh wait, there's some more stuff here. Let's see. President Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, says both Ukraine and the U.S. are determined not to turn the war into a frozen conflict. Quote, our position here fully coincides with that of our American partners, end quote. That's part and parcel of the peace talks. Ceasefire proposal. So Putin says the fighting has to end, but says that a ceasefire should also lead to an enduring peace. This is a quote, should lead to enduring peace and remove underlying causes of the crisis, end quote. So that's basically Russia's official response to the agreement that Ukraine made to a 30-day ceasefire. The Russian government nominally says it's willing to entertain it, but it says it would prefer that a ceasefire happen as part of substantive peace talks rather than happening before substantive peace talks. given that they're saying that those peace talks should resolve the underlying causes of the crisis, that's probably going to be a bridge too far, given how far apart Kiev and Moscow are on the underlying causes. So I suspect Moscow is not really interested in a ceasefire here and is probably just jerking around the United States and Ukraine so that it can avoid being blamed for a quote-unquote failure of the talks. It's also possible that they might entertain a ceasefire and are just waiting for their offensive in Kursk to come to an end, because the Ukrainian position in Kursk has been significantly reduced over the past couple weeks. For those of you who maybe don't remember, Ukraine last year launched an offensive into a Russian province called Kursk. And the idea was that they wanted to try to get the Russian army to redirect some of its forces that were progressing in Donetsk and Lugansk away from those theaters and into a new theater. And it didn't really work. The Russians didn't really redirect all that many people. The result was that the Ukrainians were able to take pretty significant ground in the short term, but since then have been slowly ground down. And at this point, they're on the verge of being ejected from the province. So it could be that Putin wants to maximize his negotiating position by ensuring that circumstances on the ground are such that he can enter into substantive peace negotiations without the Ukrainians holding any territory that they could use as a negotiating chip in those negotiations. So it might be that once Ukrainian forces have been mostly ejected from Kursk or completely ejected, then maybe Moscow comes to the table and agrees to a 30-day ceasefire. But I'm still pretty skeptical. I'm very skeptical they'll even agree to that much. Even if they do, the peace negotiations that would follow are not going to be any less complicated any less complicated than they have been since the war started. You know, both sides have very diametrically opposed positions, and Moscow knows that it has leverage in terms of the weakness of Ukraine's military and in terms of the unwillingness of Western partners to actually intervene directly in the conflict. So that means they kind of have the high cards, and a peace deal right now doesn't necessarily benefit them, given that hypothetically they could get what they want just through combat. Mm-hmm. So until that problem is squared, I don't really see the conflict significantly changing trajectory. It's entirely possible I could be surprised. Maybe Ukraine is willing to make some big concessions that they haven't really voiced a willingness to give yet. Could be that Moscow is willing to do some concessions that you wouldn't think they would be willing to do. Maybe a miracle happens and the Trump administration actually has a real plan for this. But I'm extremely skeptical on all three counts. I haven't seen any real evidence for any of those possibilities. So until something changes in that calculus, I've got to think that this is going to end up being an extended piece of theater by the Trump administration so that it can claim to have delivered something close to what it promised when he was running for office, that being that he could end the war very quickly. I think most likely outcome, maybe best case outcome for the Trump administration, is that they successfully negotiate a 30-day ceasefire and then oversee the failure of substantive peace negotiations and then blame one or the other party for a resumption of hostilities that follows out from that. I think that would allow the Trump administration to say that, hey, we stopped the killing for a while, and now that it's resumed, it's totally not our fault, and then they can just pretend like it doesn't matter anymore. Mm. That's pretty much what I predicted what would happen back before the election, and then also in December when it came up, when the topic came up again. And so I'm thinking thus far, given what I've seen, that I may have been right. That may have been a pretty decent prediction on my part. A little more tooting of my own horn in that regard. We'll see. I've been wrong plenty of times before. This could easily still be one of them, but so far I'm doing okay as far as forecasting.
Reasonable news forecaster. At least higher than 50%.
Yeah. So the most recent stuff on Ukraine, I guess this is more Ukraine adjacent. The president of Poland repeated a call for the U.S. to base nuclear weapons in Poland. That's something that they've kind of been asking for on again, off again for the past few years since the war started, because they're concerned, obviously, about the potential threat that Russia poses. Let's see. Also, he backed calls for the EU to seize Russian assets You might remember at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict in 2022, the West, the United States, Western Europe, etc., seized hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Russian assets. And the Russians, of course, want them back. They're saying that as part of a peace deal, they would want those returned. And so that's made it somewhat controversial for some people in the West to say that actually we should just seize them and use them to help fund Ukraine and its reconstruction. So on the one hand, that would be great for Ukraine. It would help, the Europeans pay for, their part of supporting Ukraine. But the downside is that it makes peace harder to get, because that is a major negotiating chip that they could use to try to get Russia to give concessions. But if you just seize it permanently and de facto hand it over to Ukraine, that chip is off the table, and your negotiating position is actually a little weaker. So there's been a lot of arguing about that over the past couple of years. And so I think the weight of opinion is shifting more in favor of seizing it now. And the Polish president coming out and saying as such is kind of just the latest evidence in that. Let's see, and then ceasefire talks. Oh, some more comments by Putin illustrating why he's skeptical about a 30-day ceasefire. Quote, how will those 30 days be used? For Ukraine to mobilize, rearm, train people, or none of that? Then a question, how will that be controlled? Who will give the order to end the fighting? At what cost? Who decides who has broken any possible ceasefire over 2,000 kilometers? All those questions need meticulous work from both sides. Who polices it, end quote. So some pretty legitimate points there. If you are going to have a ceasefire, you need a way to police it, you need a way to define it, to implement it, and none of that has been talked about yet. However, that all kind of goes without saying. Like, given that they're talking about a ceasefire, it's kind of assumed that that's all going to be worked out once they agree to it in principle. So citing those as reasons not to do it or why they're skeptical about it, that's more of an excuse not to do it than a substantive concern. Oh, another bit of news. This isn't really surprising, but I think it just kind of underlines the Trump administration's position. On the subject of Ukraine joining the NATO military alliance, Trump responded to a question in that vein, quote, everybody knows what the answer to that is, end quote. And of course, the admin is pretty well known at this point for being opposed to Ukraine's formal membership in NATO. Some people aligned with Trump in the Senate here in the United States have come out and issued some harebrained schemes about Ukraine not joining NATO, but then if they come under attack again, then they immediately join NATO. Like bizarre shit like that. I don't know that that's on the table, but given how clownish a lot of American foreign policy has been, under the Trump administration in particular, I would not be surprised if that ended up being something they pushed. I don't think it'll work, because I don't think Putin or Moscow is going to accept that at all. That's got to be pretty obvious NATO membership, de facto NATO membership from their perspective. And of course, they're dead set opposed to that. And then the absolute latest thing I had is that an American envoy, Witkoff, a real estate guy of all fucking people, that Trump gets along with, he met with Putin in Moscow in order to talk about all this. And the latest word is that Putin said that there had been progress in the talks, but insists that details have yet to be worked out. Details have yet to be worked out is definitely a statement that I have associated very frequently with the Trump administration, both in the first term and thus far in the second. So I think that's more evidence that this may end up being just more theater. But it's also early in the talks, so we'll see. I'm willing to reserve judgment for the moment. But that's where we are in Ukraine. Not a whole lot going on with regard to tariffs. I can kind of blow through that. Ontario, the province of Ontario actually controls exports of its electricity to the United States. They had been threatening to hike prices in retaliation for the steel aluminum tariffs that the United States had imposed. Trump responded with a 50% tariff hike on Canadian, oh, well, that's not the retaliation. Trump made some threats about tariffing Canada even more because of the hike in electricity. And so in response to that, the province of Ontario ended up walking that back. They ended up reversing the price hike, basically, in exchange for the Trump administration agreeing to talks. So that ended up going nowhere, in other words. But the other big news was just the steel and aluminum tariffs actually going into place. Oh, that's what it was. The Trump retaliation was that they were going to hike tariff and aluminum tariffs even higher than the tariffs had already been hiked earlier in the week. That's what it was. Okay. But yeah, the tariff and the steel and aluminum tariffs that had been planned actually were implemented, and there was a whole bunch of angsting amongst the countries that exported a lot of steel and aluminum to the United States. So Brazil, South Korea, European Union, all of them made complaints, have come to Washington to lobby for exemptions. None of that has resulted in anything thus far. The European Union, for its part, did implement tariffs on $28 billion worth of goods in retaliation for the steel aluminum tariffs, targeting things like boats, bourbon, motorbikes, just kind of miscellaneous American industrial goods. Trump, for his part, responded to that by threatening a 200% tariff on European alcohol. That hasn't actually happened yet, but that is sort of out in the ether. We'll see if anything comes of it.
That would piss a lot of people off.
Yeah. Other exporters of steel, Brazil, I think, has not implemented retaliatory tariffs yet, but I think it is threatening them. I thought it was interesting that the UK and Australia both said that they would refrain from retaliatory tariffs. So it seems like they're taking sort of the soft touch approach to trying to handle Trump. Don't escalate, just try to flatter him and appeal to him. That's more the direction they seem to be going there. I don't think it's going to work out for them, but we'll see. It'll be an interesting contrast with the European Union, which is going hard. But yeah, that's all I really had for trade for the past week.
Appreciate the breakdown. You have an interesting chat to enjoy after this.
Oh God, how is it interesting this time?
Saying that Ukraine started the war.
Yeah, we've had some guys on YouTube saying that. I don't know why.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who in Russia believes Ukraine started the war? Because liberals in Russia know that it didn't. They don't like the Putin government. They want change. They hate it. They don't trust it. They think Russia started the war. But then Russian nationalists also think Russia started the war. Like, the most hardcore guys, they think Russia was well within its rights to invade Ukraine because they see it as within Russia's sphere of influence. So even from a far-right nationalist perspective, they think Russia started the war. So who does that leave? It seems like the only people in Russia that really believe that Ukraine started the war would be people just watching too much TV, because Russian propaganda is about the only outlet that I've heard that idea from.
Mm.
Bizarre to me.
Yeah, the memes are pretty dank. And I think playing devil's advocate is something that a lot of internet people like to take the stance of, especially from a place of comfort and distance from the conflicts. It gives you attention. It makes you appear more intellectual. Like, you understand something that other people don't. If you take an opposing position and you really take a firm stance, you're on an island of what you perceive to be as the truth, and everyone around you is just not quite as smart as you are. When most science says that the greater share of evidence points to the truth rather than your specific, very unique opinion, or some kind of propaganda opinion that doesn't really make sense. But defining your terms is a good starting point. This is something that Kukio would point out. He would say, are you just having a semantic argument? Are we defining what war is? Because war being initiated is usually involved with combat aggression, which there was a very clear side of where that occurred. Russia clearly invaded Ukraine and has taken territory, and more so over time. I don't understand where the confusion is. If you were there on the battlefield, you see, okay, here's a sovereign line that the rest of the world agrees is a line of national sovereignty, and these are tanks and these are military personnel going over the border and lobbing missiles at shit. It's very straightforward.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the YouTube guy was saying that Ukraine was about to launch an offensive targeting the separatist republics, and so Russia preemptively intervened, and so Ukraine started it in that regard. or maybe not even, I don't remember exactly. He may have said that they actually did launch an invasion of the separatist republics, and then the 22 invasion was a response to that. Something like that. Something very weird. Like, I read it and I was like, does anybody actually believe that? Like, it's weird. There's so many people wrapped up in like online narratives that only exist in the ether of propaganda. Like, again, even people like who are pro-war in Russia don't think that. So it just seems like a bizarre position to take.
Yep, but we're all trying our best to make sense of reality, and we're given very different pieces of information sometimes. So I try to be compassionate with people who firmly believe stuff that, to me, seems completely off, but they're trying their best to base on the information they have. I probably have some things that I'm not correct about. And that's a point of humility that is good for everyone to practice. There are some things in your mind right now that are not correct. They are factually incorrect because someone gave you the wrong idea. Doesn't mean you're dumb. Doesn't mean you're not smart enough to figure something out. If you're given bad information, even smart people can have the wrong idea. So just because someone said something doesn't make it true. Stay safe and try to weigh the evidence. I appreciate people who challenge their perspective who don't necessarily agree with us on a lot of things and continue to watch and see what we have to say. It's interesting.
You know what that's a good cue for?
Huh.
The usual disclaimer.
Nice. We'll squeeze it at the end so we don't get sued.
I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. We do enjoy all of the feedback.
Thank you. Well, thank you, chat, for your engagement this evening. Thank you, Steve Whiskey, for handling questions. Agent Smith, as always, thank you for your notes and your effort and your time. And we will see you all on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. See you next time. Always a privilege.
GG.